How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
So yeah,
I'd be down for that.
yeah, maybe we just do it.
Do you want me to just record it on my own and send it to you?
No, it needs to be a discussion. So me and Gary can give you shit.
Yeah. No, that sounds perfect.
This is his top 10 horror movies that we're talking about.
Right, yeah.
So here's how stupid Todd is. Ready to go, Todd. Jeez.
Well, the public anxiously awaits your top 10, Todd. So get it
Yeah,
together.
well, I did get a message from somebody saying, hey, I'm looking forward to hearing that top 10.
Yeah, well, so is everyone, but
Yeah.
Todd has to treat it like it's a damn science experiment. And
And one of his movies is Spider-Man 3, which is super weird. Come on, guys. Those Venom the Venom scenes are really spooky.
To be fair, that movie is horrific.
I mean, it's Sam Raimi.
There you go.
That's true. That's true. The Doc Ock scene is good in part 2. So
Yeah, that's a good Sam Raimi horror scene.
well, hello and welcome to the Psychotronic Film Society. Why did I say that? Because it was in front of my face. I really did do that on accident because earlier you were telling me about the links in my profile being messed up. So I had Psychotronic Film Society in front of me. Welcome to Cinema Shock. Yeah. Welcome to Cinema Shock. It's the podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. I'm one of your co-hosts, Gary Horde.
I'm co-host Justin Bishop. Joining us today.
What the fuck is wrong with your voice?
I don't know. It just does this sometimes, man. Sometimes it just comes and goes. I don't know what's wrong with it. Anyway, joining us today, writer, comedian, and paranormal investigator extraordinaire, Mr. Todd A. Davis. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
You
can throw in ne'er-do-well if you just can't. It seems like
Isn't that like your
that's my lot in life, guys.
Isn't that like your legit job? Like you're like a paralegal? Is that like ghost lawyer?
Yep,
Yes.
ghost lawyer.
We sue the sheets off of ghosts. That's what we do.
Oh, wow. I like it. That sounds like a sitcom in the making, honestly.
Yeah, I was just thinking that sounds like a really fun job.
Paralegals coming soon to Amazon Prime, starring Nick Frost and Simon Pegg. You heard it here first, folks.
Perfect.
Oh man! So welcome everyone to week 5 of The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper. This is where we really get into why we call it The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper, and we're gonna. The way we're handling this series, we'll explain it at the end of the episode, but the way we're handling this series is going to be a little bit unique compared to what we've done in the past for reasons that will become clear a couple weeks down the line. But for now, our 5th episode of what we're calling The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper Part 1, which is, the beginning of his career. The beginning of the end, one could say. So last week we talked about the Funhouse. We've all got a little bit more energy this week, I think. We're all slightly more alive this week.
We're less hungover this week. So hope you enjoyed the Funhouse, and hopefully a carnival was enough excitement for you that you didn't need us to seem excited.
Well, you said we're all less hungover. Like we're still like maybe a little. I'm not. I'm fine. I'm drinking water.
It was a
I
long
had some
day.
sangria with brunch, so yeah.
Sangria with brunch.
Yeah, a little
bold.
I'm feeling pretty good right now.
I do have a beer today, so
I'll probably get one later. But right now we're drinking water because I'm almost 40 and I got to do that every now and then.
Gotta lube up.
So while working on the Funhouse movie we talked about last week, Tobe Hooper was finally given kind of the big break in Hollywood that he'd been working towards. Not with the Funhouse. That was a Hollywood movie, but not exactly the big break because it was still kind of small potatoes by Hollywood studio standards. But while he was working on the Funhouse, he was personally selected by Steven Spielberg who wanted him to direct a film that he was producing based off of Spielberg's love of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago because, as you remember, we kind of shared office spaces there on the Universal lot. But the film that he tapped Tobe Hooper for, called Night Skies, never came to be. But some of its ideas morphed into a later film, one whose name would always kind of be synonymous with Hooper's career, at least as synonymous as Chainsaw, only for very different reasons. And the resulting film, one that had repercussions that would be felt throughout the rest of Tobe Hooper's career and honestly throughout the rest of his life, was 1982's Poltergeist.
The house looks just like the one next to it. And the one next to that. And the one next to that. A young couple live in it.
Give Ken a kiss.
You are so obnoxious.
With their 3 children.
Honey, chew each bite 10 times.
And something more.
They're here. Sweetie, remember last night? Do you remember when you woke up and you said they were here? Uh-huh. Well, who did you meet? Who's here?
TV people. I've never sensed anything like it.
Now Steven Spielberg crosses a frightening new threshold into a world within our own. Its form is revealed.
What is it?
Its focus is clear. And the games are over. Poltergeist. It knows what scares you.
You know, we talk a lot about how Hooper is like dedicated to movies, like he loves movies, but you know, for this to be the tragedy of Tobe Hooper, one thing I was just thinking about was that something has to be going good first, and Toby's had a struggle already. And so the thing to know about, if you're a director, I feel like to be a film director, you've got to have a little ego there. So he's probably already beaten down at this point. You know, we learned from Texas Chainsaw. I mean, he had the idea to do Chainsaw to get to Hollywood or to get the attention of Hollywood.
Right.
And he finally got to LA. Like, he was never meant to be a Texas guy. He wanted to be in the lights and the stardom and the thick of it. And for some reason, Chainsaw comes with this reputation of pornographic. Like, it's awful. And it just almost ruined him in a way to like a lot of people. So here he is working his way. He's taking these jobs that he gets, but none of them are like the break he probably feels like he deserves at this time.
Because he's clearly got skills. You know, he's clearly got skills. And Chainsaw made a lot of money, but it also kind of pigeonholed him not just as a horror director, as many horror directors often are, but as like kind of a exploitation movie director. And it didn't help probably that his follow-up was very much an exploitation film, Eaten Alive. But this week, you know, this movie we're talking about this week, it's this was kind of like the one. You know, he got the big call from Steven Spielberg, like, who is, you know, we know him now as a legend. Like, this was that kind of at the beginning of his legend, and he was sort of at what may be considered the peak of his career. I don't know if his peak has ever waned, but
he's always been Steven Spielberg. But yeah, right. I mean, this is Spielberg, like at the freshest Spielberg there is. Like,
yeah, the new up and comer, like still very young, like in his 30s. You know, long career ahead of him. So this movie, Night Skies. What was Night Skies? Well, after the success of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Columbia wanted a sequel. And while Spielberg didn't have any interest in a sequel to that film, he also didn't want Columbia to make a sequel without his involvement, because that's what Universal had done with Jaws a few years earlier, and he was not very happy with the results. So instead, he came up with a horror movie treatment called Watch the Skies, later renamed Night Skies. Spielberg had no intention of directing Night Skies. See, at the time, he was in the middle of making Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is when he first started talking to Tobe, and he was under contract to make a movie with Universal next, which made him unavailable to direct the film for Columbia. So the story of Night Skies, it's about a family who was terrorized by a group of malevolent aliens. They're on like a secluded farmhouse. You know, it sounds, you know, cool treatment. The original treatment, by the way, sounds pretty wild. If you want a really good deep dive into the movie that was never made, named Night Skies, I recommend a podcast called The Greatest Movies Never Made. And I think it was their very first episode of the podcast. They actually covered Night Skies, and they got a hold of the treatment and break down the script and everything. And it sounds honestly like a bad idea. But it just as a follow-up to something like Close Encounters, it sounds like a bad idea, but it's
at least 45 like 45 minutes just strictly dedicated to anal probing.
But Spielberg wanted Tobe Hooper to direct this movie, to direct Night Skies. So Hooper at the time, he was still working on Funhouse, and he didn't really have any interest in directing an alien invasion movie anyway, maybe due to the poor experience he'd had on The Dark, which ended up being an alien invasion movie, even though it wasn't originally planned that way. Besides, Hooper had a better idea. So while he was overseeing the post-production on the Funhouse, Tobe Hooper moved into director Robert Weiss's old offices on the Universal Studios lot. And among the items left in Weiss's desk was a book on the occult, specifically a book on poltergeists, which was an element that had played a major role in Weiss's 1963 film of The Haunting. So this was clearly something that Weiss had been using, as a research item. And it was Hooper who suggested to Spielberg that they collaborate on a movie about ghosts and hauntings rather than about aliens. And Spielberg was, he was into the idea. He was a big fan of The Haunting. He had grown up with that movie, just as Tobe Hooper had. So by this point, even after having Rick Baker create a prototype for the lead alien in Night Skies, which reportedly cost about $70,000, Spielberg had started kind of having second thoughts about the film. So after, he had this rough and tumble shoot of Raiders. He talks about it in interviews. He's like, I was doing this movie with all these explosions and, Harrison Ford punching Nazis, and it was intense. It was an intense shoot. So we kind of wanted to do something more tranquil.
I meant to mention earlier too, that one of the things about, when I was reading stuff with Hooper, he seemed to have like an idea of how you approach this thing. Probably not unlike what Spielberg was already thinking with the alien side of things, that, you mentioned The Haunting, and that had been maybe the most successful ghost movie ever made, at the time.
Yeah.
And so there had not been another one. I think in an interview I saw he mentioned Hell House, but one thing that was different about that movie was that you have to go in with this preconceived notion that you accept that hauntings are real, that poltergeists are real. But one thing he liked about The Haunting that he wanted to take over to a ghost story of his own is he thought one of the scarier parts is starting out with the approach of it from science and just treating it like a scientific phenomenon rather than just ghosts. And so you can kind of see that in Poltergeist, and that maybe even what, I don't know for a fact, but what appealed to Steven Spielberg is like, no, we can take like kind of the same concept and use the sciencey aspect of it, but deal with ghosts instead.
I totally got sucked in on the sciencey part of this because I don't know. I know it's just a lot of expositional dialogue, but it did kind of suck me in a little bit.
Oh, it's very interesting.
And it helped me. It helped legitimize what was happening so that I could disconnect my suspend my disbess.
Well, what you're saying is literally the thing that he said in some interviews I was looking at was that he thought that it's one thing that if you already think about ghosts as a real thing or something like that, but if you approach it from science first and you're skeptical, it softens up the audience to like suspend their disbelief. Exactly what you said. Yeah. I think that was a line Hooper specifically gave, that was his goal with the making of the movie.
So Spielberg kind of gives up on Night Skies, and because he decides he doesn't want to do a scary alien movie, basically, is kind of what he's saying. He wants to do something more chill. And we'll dive into the rest of that story probably deeper down the line, when we cover Spielberg's career, or at least maybe some of his genre films. But instead of doing Night Skies, what he decides to do as a follow-up was start working on a film that would become E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
Little known to him, he would still end up terrifying my wife for the rest of her life.
She's the only one, honestly, that's scared of me. You're of E.T.?
Kat she is not a fan. It freaked her out as a little kid, so she steers clear.
I think we're gonna have to, when we do an ET episode, they're both coming on as guests. We're having an ET roundtable All right. So several ideas for Night Skies wound up in E.T., but a lot of the other ideas for it were reused in various other Spielberg-produced projects, such as Joe Dante's Gremlins and, of course, Poltergeist, which sees a family being tormented not by malevolent aliens, but by malevolent spirits. And Hooper also wanted to direct a ghost story because he had actually had some personal experience with the subject matter. Here's a quote from Tobe Hooper regarding that. He says, Gary, you do a good Tobe Hooper voice. You want to do this quote?
I actually had some poltergeist experiences after my father died. When I was 17, water glasses, plates, other stuff in the kitchen exploded, were replaced, and exploded again. For several weeks, some very strange stuff went on. The experience left me with the desire to do a film about this phenomena. He tells a lot of stories about this. You can find like little interviews on YouTube and stuff. Here's the thing I'm going to start doing just to the podcast audience and all of you here with me right now. I'm going to stop saying that I'm pulling this from interviews. Just trust me that I did that. I don't know why I always feel like I have to justify that I saw this somewhere. Yeah, I swear to God, I saw it somewhere.
You don't have to quote your sources every time. You can every now and then, but everyone knows that we're not just making this shit up.
You're not being graded, Gary.
I always feel weird, like though, when I just jump in, I'm like, so Tobe, the thing with Tobe is he dealt with this,
so
like
what you're
like,
explaining is that you did not personally speak to Tobe Hooper.
Right. I did not personally talk to him, but I saw him talk about it. Yeah. But with this, yeah, the glass is exploding. He says he saw that exact same stuff, like plates crash on the floor being piled up. Like he swears this all happened after his dad. He's told this many times. And even like his mom and him, like at night in the house, like he'd hear his dad's rocking chair just going crazy in the living room. And he'd wake up and his mom would think it was Tobe in the rocking chair. And Tobe got up thinking it was his mom in the rocking chair. And, just weird stuff like that. He said even years later, he got into the process of leasing the house and his son stopped by the house to check on it. And there was a guy inside the house and his son started chasing him and he ran into a room and disappeared. And the room was just like a cold room. Yeah, wow. He describes like turning a corner one day and walking into a shadow, and it was just like freezing cold. So he started calling friends. He said he would invite friends over, and his friends would witness shit inside this house. So it was just like a fascinating topic that he'd been into since his dad had passed.
Wow. Have you either of you guys ever seen a ghost?
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do tell, Todd. I want to hear.
So
if it's a good story, if it's boring, then don't bother.
Well, I had some experiences. My mother passed away when I was 19, and there were some experiences that were to let me know that she was on the other side and that everything was going to be okay. And that's going to get a little sappy, but the stuff
your mom haunts my dreams too, Todd.
You wouldn't have been able to handle my mom, Gary. Okay, fair enough. So, my wife and I enjoy going to places for our anniversary. So, and we always enjoyed doing the little ghost tours around. Usually, it's a more historic city. We've done, Philadelphia, Savannah, and some other places as well. But one of our anniversaries, we went to St. Augustine, Florida, and there's a big. The fort is still there. The town is, it's one of those coastal towns that's very haunted and all that stuff. But there was a story of a little girl who used to greet and wish well people coming and going from the city. And eventually she caught a disease and passed away. But there was a story that her spirit could still be seen there. And they told us the name. I forget if it was, Elizabeth or Bethany, or I forget what her name was, but I went there. I closed my eyes. I sort of put my one hand on my knee and I held my hand out in front of me. And I said, "Give me your hand, sweetie." And I felt my hand go down. Like she put her hand in my hand. I was like, holy shit. And then there's a haunted lighthouse in the same area. And when we first got there, we went and took a ghost tour of this lighthouse, and it's a beautiful old lighthouse. They said, if you've got cameras, start snapping pictures, because you'll see some orbs in your photos that aren't here in real life. And I snapped a couple, and yeah, I've got a couple of orbs on some pictures that I took at that lighthouse. So it's fun stuff. Have either of you had any sort of supernatural experiences?
I have not.
I can say, like, I'm pretty skeptical. I always look at myself like the guy in Blair Witch where they're in the tent and they hear the baby crying and the girl's like, do you hear that? Do you hear that? And he's like, shut up. There's nothing there. She's like, there's a baby crying. There's no fucking baby. Go back to sleep. Go back to sleep. Did you hear that? No, I did not hear that. Shut the fuck up. Like, that's generally how I am about these kind of things. But I did go to my first time going to Illinois. I stayed at my girlfriend's dad's house and house sitted for him. And he said that the house was haunted. And everything that happened in that house would take like a whole episode. I'm not saying it was haunted, but it was freaky as hell. And the dog at like 1 a.m., a part of the house sitting was I had to take care of his dog. And the dog would go to the basement door that had it's the door, the stairway down into the basement. He would stand in front of that basement door. The dad had written a letter. I should work this out better, but he had written a letter and it said, I told the ghost, who was supposedly his grandfather. He's like, I told granddad to stay down in the basement and not bother anybody. Every day at like 1 a.m., that dog would go to I remember it was like 3 because it was the witching hour. I remember looking that up. It was the witching hour, like 3 a.m. And he would go to the door and he would bark at the door and growl. And it was super fucking creepy. The only other thing her dad had written in the thing was, I did tell it to fuck with Wes. Well, Wes was one of her friends. Well, one night, Wes came over and I got to meet him and we hung out. We watched a movie and me, him, and another guy I showed him the letter and then he was like, let's go down there. Let's go look. And I'm like, okay, because I didn't want to be a pussy. I mean, that's just the way it is. So we went down there and all there was in the basement was, of course, the one fucking string light bulb hanging down from the ceiling. And you like have to pull the string and it comes on. And we did it. And there's like a few rooms. And like, which room do we go in first? And then the light bulb blew out. And we're like, what the fuck? And like I don't even remember getting back upstairs. Like I just was all of a sudden. And anyway, that was a whole thing, man. It was a
I've never had anything like that. And I don't know that I believe in ghosts as like in a traditional, like I believe in ghosts kind of way, like I don't necessarily, I believe there are phenomena that people see that they believe are ghosts. I don't necessarily believe that those are spirits of the dead in the way that we think of them. I think that there's probably a scientific explanation for those types of things, even if it's a science that we don't quite yet understand, and that's a deep-seated thing in my own other beliefs. That's where that comes from. But I also think the power of suggestion is very, very strong.
Oh yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I even look back at this and I'm like, maybe I'm somehow piecing together like multiple things that just fucked me up that week I was staying in this house, but I wouldn't go back.
Like if you had never been told that there was a ghost there and you walked down to a basement and the light bulb blew out, you would never have thought twice of it other than that's what light bulbs do.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. So,
but because somebody had told you that, you immediately attributed it to a ghost.
Right. I could see that. And I mean, it's weird. I've always said like ghosts are one of those things that are hard to believe unless you see them. And I don't want to ever see one. So,
all right. So anyway, back to the movie. So once they had settled on, having this paranormal subject matter, Spielberg wrote the script with co-writers Michael Grace and Mark Victor with the intent that Hooper would direct and Spielberg would produce. At the time that Poltergeist was being made, Spielberg was under contract to direct E.T., which was set to be released in the summer of 1982, and he contractually could not work on as a director on another film. There's also some information out there, if you look into this, that says that there was an impending director's strike, and that's why Spielberg couldn't direct it, because he was directing E.T. and but that doesn't make any sense to me because he was already directing another movie. But his contract with Universal did say, hey, when you're making E.T., you can only make E.T., So that's really why he ended up as a producer and not a director on this one.
It's got his fingerprints all over it.
Oh yeah. We're going to discuss that in great detail. Don't you worry. That's a huge part of the discussion on this film.
And another aspect of it too, just to throw in here, is that Hooper says that, there is the script that they were working with that Spielberg had worked on with Michael. What would we say? Grace? Is that how you say it? Grace?
That's how I'm going to say it because I don't really know.
And Victor. And according to Hooper, that script had to be reworked quite a bit. He says that they had like Carol Ann dying in the first act of the movie, and she was crushed inside the closet. And that was just stuff like when they got with the producer and stuff, they're like, man, we can't shoot this screenplay. Like, it's not going to work this way. And so he said he and Spielberg and Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall spent quite a bit of time tossing around ideas and reworking the entire screenplay, and even including prepping for a sequel that never happened, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I mean, a sequel did happen, but not the one that you're talking about.
Not the one they put together.
Yeah. Poltergeist went before cameras with a budget of about $9.5 million, which is another big step up for Tobe Hooper. He'd made Salem Slot for a big studio, but of course that was made for television. And he'd made The Funhouse for a studio, but it was, still only like a $3 million budget. So still fairly small. But Poltergeist, I mean, this was without a doubt mainstream studio filmmaking. And the production reflected that. This is a big production for a filmmaker who had started his career, in a desolate farmhouse in the Texas boondocks that was filled with, rotting animal parts.
Oh, for sure.
This one stretched across 3 sound stages at MGM, not to mention the location shooting, and featured more than 100 optical effects shots. That final shot of the house imploding, that was actually, it's one of my favorite effects in the film because I think it holds up better than some of the other ones.
Yeah.
And that was created using this highly detailed miniature. It was like 6 feet wide by 4 feet high. So, pretty big miniature. And they actually just it was somehow mechanically able to, make that implosion. And it was created by Industrial Light and Magic. The majority of the effects in the film were created by ILM. And I mean, ILM is huge. ILM is a huge production or a huge effects company, the biggest probably in the world at the time, if not still. So, I mean, there was no doubt that this was an A-list production for Hooper.
Like you said, just totally not what the guy's used to. Is top notch. He talks a lot about just even the idea of having a 90-day schedule to shoot a movie is just insane.
Yeah.
And like you're talking about the technical marvel, the whole thing is this was school for him. He never dealt with optical effects like this. He buried himself during this time into learning about the special effects, learning about this kind of stuff. It was like film school all over again for him in a lot of ways, and learning how to deal with a lot of these things going on in this movie. And he learned it. He said by the end of this film, he's an expert on this stuff. Like,
kind of have to be.
Yeah. But he, it just, it's interesting to see. He seemed very excited about this movie, just all of the different stuff. And when we talk about special effects, like the stuff you're talking about there, and even like stages with like spinning rooms and shit like that, which is
like
crazy.
The one with at the end of the movie where she's like on the ceiling and stuff. And later, I mean, even earlier in the film with the kids like hanging from the bedposts and stuff, that was all done with sets that were on like hydraulics that would spin, it's huge. I mean, for someone like Tobe Hooper, who is a very good director, but hasn't really been given the chance to show off what he can do on a bigger canvas, this is a big deal,
Yeah, it's the first, I think the way he put it in one instance was like the first fully measured approach to a production that he's ever been a part of.
Yeah. So with an A-list production comes an A-list cast, of course, starring as Diane and Stephen Freeling were Joe Beth Williams, who is probably maybe the first movie MILF in this movie.
Girl, get it.
And she had a memorable turn in Stir Crazy a couple of years earlier with Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. And then Craig T. Nelson played Stephen, her husband. And so Craig T. Nelson, Coach. But before he had become known as the guy from Coach, he was, and of course, as the patriarch of The Incredibles, doing the voice of The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible. He began his career as a stand-up comic, where he was one of the early members of the Groundlings. And then when he moved into movies, he initially moved into doing movies in kind of trashy, low-budget genre movies like The Return of Count Yorga, Scream, Blackula Scream, and Flesh Gordon. So Todd, there is
Wow.
hope for you yet.
I mean, I always take some notes while we're going through stuff for me to look up later. I'm gonna deep dive and see if I can find any footage of Craig T. Nelson doing stand up.
Oh yeah, I bet it's out there. I bet it's on YouTube, man. Honestly,
Oh, yeah.
but this movie wouldn't necessarily indicate it, but clearly he's started a sitcom for years and years, so he's definitely got comedic timing down.
Well, it's super weird. I think we've found over the years, and maybe even as early as this, it's been a thing. But comedians seem to have like some good timing for horror movies. There's that close marriage between the two.
There really is. I mean, I just watched. It's not really horror, but in that genre, wheelhouse, Promising Young Woman. With the exception of Carey Mulligan, is almost entirely cast with comedians, people who are normally known for comedic work. And I think you're exactly right. There's that big marriage, and we're going to talk more in coming weeks about, I think, the marriage of comedy and horror. We've talked about it a little bit on the show in the past, but I think we're really going to dive into it in a few weeks.
Another weird marriage with horror is sexy ladies, and so I know this is a common theme, but it's hard to be frightened for Jo Beth Williams when she's not wearing pants, and because part of me is like, oh, this would suck for her. Also, she is so hot.
You're distracted. That's what it is. Cast as the Freeling children. You've got Dominique Dunn as Dana, Oliver Robbins as Robbie, and then Heather O'Rourke as Carol Ann. They were all fairly new to show business, having appeared in few, if any, projects before this one. And unfortunately, some of them appeared in very little after Poltergeist for reasons we'll get to later in the show. Other prominent roles in the film included Beatrice Straits as Dr. Martha Lesh, the paranormal investigator, Richard Lawson as Dr. Ryan Mitchell, and then Return of the Living Dead star James Karen as Mr. Teague, who I always forget that he's in this movie until he pops up. But he's great in Return of the Living Dead, which is another movie we'll be discussing very soon on the show.
Heather O'Rourke, Hooper seems to have such an affinity for her, and obviously there's going to be stuff coming up. But he says he saw her in the MGM commissary one day. She was just 5 years old, but they were hanging out there, and she was there for some other thing. Her sister was doing a scene for Pennies in Heaven, and so Heather wasn't even training to be an actress or planning on being an actress, but he said there was just something about her, just the way she interacted with her mom or something. It was man, she'd be really good for this role. He just saw something in her, and so they got her there. But he said the cool part with her is that she didn't even really have yet a concept of acting. It wasn't, there were moments for her that they weren't torturing her or anything, but there were real moments that he said she was never afraid of the crew or anything. It was just something would startle her. The biggest scene I think that you hear about, if you look it up, is the wind blowing the toys off the shelves behind her and stuff like that she got kind of messed up around there. And he said that she was also, one of the things we've mentioned in all of these other Hooper movies before is that he talks about getting real anxious to he puts himself in a bad mood to get other people in a bad mood, to get them into weird moves.
Perfect thing to do with a 5-year-old.
Well, he said that the problem is that she was very good at reading his anxiety the whole time. And so even when he didn't intend to, she could tell if he was behind, he had a little something going on in his mind, she would start to get upset. And then he's just no, I can't do this because now she's getting upset. Now she's going to start crying, and you can't cry right now. And
it's not a crying scene.
Yeah. He talks about filming the scene in the kitchen with the kitchen table and, the chair stacking and stuff. Or she talks about the television people when they're looking at the TV. He says he's got to get the close up of her. And he's I'm behind this. I can't come back to this location. He's so I'm thinking about that. And she's looking at me something's wrong. I'm not doing something right, or something's weird. And she's she starts to cry. And he's no, don't cry. Do not cry. And it only makes it worse.
Yeah.
He says, what's her face? Jo Beth has to come in. Yeah. Has to come in and coddle her and like hug her and
mother her. Yeah.
Mother her basically and get her through the scene to like get the shot and everything. He's like, I know she needs a nap or something, but like, we can't cry. We can't cry right now.
Oh man.
But she does have a great screen presence.
She really does.
And the chemistry between her and Joe Beth is
it's really great.
Like legitimate. Like
it's a big part of why the movie works, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another one of the things too, the Beatrice Straight role, or the Dr. Martha Lesh. She is based on, he says, a legit parapsychologist at UCLA that he knew, and he knew her through Friedkin, because Friedkin had used her on Exorcist.
No shit,
parapsychologist,
really?
Yeah,
as like a he had used. Not Beatrice Straight, but he had used the actual parapsychologist.
The parapsychologist
for like research.
For research purposes.
Interesting. Oh,
exactly.
Wow.
It said that you could go to UCLA and that she's like literally like she's normally teaching like psychology classes or whatever, but she is a licensed parapsychologist, but they took it as about as seriously as you expect. And she had like a small office in the basement. Just kind of like what
it sounds like. It sounds
well,
like Ghostbusters.
Yeah. And so they had her. He would. I don't know. He said that he went and met with her because he, like I said, knew her through Friedkin and got her involved. Like he kind of based this character on her and everything he saw with her. And he said he spent a lot of time with her actually, and she would like show him stuff, and he was skeptical, even though he'd had these experiences. But this story I thought was fascinating. He tells that she kept showing him photos and information they'd captured, but he would like disprove everything he saw. He was just like, nah, no, this could be anything. This could be lighting. This could be yada, yada, yada. And he said the only one that got him, that she showed him, was there was apparently this mist, these photos of mist, like on the ground in a location, and they could put it in a microscope. And when you zoomed in on the microscope, he said like every grain of the mist, like when you zoomed in at like super levels, resembled a human face.
Whoa.
It was like, I don't know what was happening there. And so, but it was also through that, though, to go back to another earlier point, is like where he was also like, this is kind of the way I want to approach this thing. It's like through a scientific approach.
Yeah. So, of course, if we are discussing the cast, we have to mention Zelda Rubinstein as Tangina Barons.
Is clear. They're clean.
He fucked it up.
Her
Fucked up your joke.
Her role is very short.
Oh my God!
But it's a good one.
So this is.
I don't know what her status was with the Screen Actors Guild, but I don't think, did it affect her membership in the Lollipop Guild?
Oh my God!
Here we Todd.
What's this guy doing?
Is it? I was just wondering.
They do. In fact, I think it's in Poltergeist 2. Craig T. Nelson actually makes a crack and calls her a munchkin in it. He does. But this was Rubinstein's.
Just to be fair, Todd is 4'8", so this is
this was Rubinstein's first major film role at the age of 48. She just decided she wanted to be an actor. Like she decided she wanted to be an actor late in life, not quite this late, but this was her first like major role in a film. She had done some stage stuff, but she would continue to act throughout her life until her death at the age of 72 in 2010. Her last role, or at least the last one that came out before she died, I think there was a one that came out right after she died, but her last one that she appeared in before she died was Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon.
Oh, cool.
She has a great little role in that. Just kind of a throwback to
totally forgot about
this
it.
role.
She's a librarian,
honestly.
right?
Yep,
Kinda.
she's a librarian. All right, so here we go. We're talking about Poltergeist. There's a big elephant in the room that you have to talk about when you talk about Poltergeist, and that is there's a controversy. There's a huge controversy around this film, and the question is, who actually directed Poltergeist? So if for some reason you are listening to this episode and you are unfamiliar with this controversy, here's a little rundown. According to Hooper, a reporter from the LA Times arrived on set as they were filming on location in Simi Valley, so they're in this neighborhood. During this visit, Tobe Hooper was overseeing the first unit, which was starting to film the sequence where Oliver Robbins encounters the tree, that later tries to murder him. And at the same time, Steven Spielberg is overseeing the second unit. They're shooting pickups for the scene at the beginning of the film where, the kids are using the little remote control cars to mess with the guy on the bike that's carrying the case of beer. So Spielberg's shooting that, just in little pickups here and there.
Supposedly he's like running out of time. So like Spielberg jumps in to help. Basically.
Yeah. And the reporter allegedly, heads back to his newsroom with a story that questions who really directed the film. Everything else you've ever heard about the controversy of ownership of Poltergeist stems from this one story in the LA Times. So if you know anything about filmmaking, which this reporter clearly didn't really know, then you know that there's nothing unusual about this scenario. There's nothing unusual about having an assistant director or a second unit director overseeing these types of shots. That's what they do. They oversee the shooting of less critical scenes, ones that might not involve, the main actors. And they're doing that at the instruction of the director. He's directing them to do that. A director doesn't just direct the actors. He directs the entire production. So Steven Spielberg, being the film's producer and writer and a pretty capable director on his own, directing some second unit stuff on the film is, because he happens to be on set anyway, is completely plausible. That's not unusual or out of the ordinary at all. So let's take a moment and talk about what a second unit really does on a movie. A second unit is often responsible for shots that make up what you would consider the tapestry of the film. They might not involve critical moments with main actors or critical plot points, but they're still needed, And a second unit exists to keep a film on schedule. They exist because shooting a film, especially one of this size, is a monumental task. And the director has a million little things to do on set every day, and he can't physically shoot every second of film, even though some like Christopher Nolan tries to, But regardless, this is a rumor that still spread. It grew into a legend, and it soured the release of the film because every review that came out mentioned the controversy. Every single one, almost. Like, there's at least some mention of it, if not a full question. Hey, this kind of looks like a Spielberg movie. Maybe Spielberg actually directed it. And it certainly soured Hooper's reputation and may very well have ruined his career.
Wow.
I mean, this is a thing, just to throw in there, that is brought up even in, 8 or 9/10 of the obituaries that were written for Tobe Hooper after his death. Like, just that this controversy comes up, which is just fucking annoying, kind of. But it's just like, why? This is so weird. Like, the man is passed, and you're still bringing up this story about him and Poltergeist.
Yeah, because the implication in the LA Times article and in that rumor, the whole story that it perpetuated, was that the implication is that Hooper wasn't up to the job. So Steven Spielberg had to step in to direct the movie. Like, without saying that, that's what they're saying, is that Spielberg, who was, Spielberg being the great director, had to step in and do this for Tobe Hooper because he couldn't get the job done. So the thing is, we talked about Sin City. Okay, Sin City has a scene directed by Quentin Tarantino, but nobody questions whether Robert Rodriguez directed the rest of that movie. Sean Cunningham directed a couple of scenes on A Nightmare on Elm Street, but nobody ever started a rumor that Wes Craven had not started that movie, or had not directed that movie. But maybe that's because Spielberg was huge at this time, so using his name had weight. Like, Sean Cunningham's name doesn't have the same weight as Steven Spielberg.
Well, Spielberg executive produced so many movies, like Back to the Future. Like, Robert Zemeckis didn't get shit on about Steven Spielberg being there, or Joe Dante and Gremlins, or those too. It's like nobody caught shit quite like Tobe Hooper did.
Well, he was the Texas Chainsaw guy. He was the guy who'd made this scummy little horror movie that happened to make a lot of money, but he hadn't really done anything else that had really told audiences that he would direct a film as capable from a technical standpoint as Poltergeist. And yeah, I mean, the film it looks like a Spielberg movie a lot of the time. It's got that look, but that's because, again, they're using the resources that come along with having an almost $10 million budget.
Well, I mean,
not
those
a $3 million budget.
Those two movies I just mentioned, I mean, literally also do that. Like,
right,
they all have that what Todd called earlier, like that Spielberg feel or whatever. Like you could totally buy that Steven Spielberg was in some way involved. Yeah, it has that suburbia sort of look, the kids, I don't know, there's the whole aesthetic of the thing.
That like Amblin vibe.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
totally.
Spielberg didn't really help matters. There are some quotes that were pulled from interviews with him that if a reporter wanted to go with the Hooper didn't direct Poltergeist angle, they definitely could have used these quotes to their advantage. For instance, here's a quote from an interview in a 1982 issue of People Weekly. So in this interview, Spielberg says, he's talking about being there on set. Oliver became scared during a scene in which a big clown doll wraps its arms around him. The arms became too tight and cut his wind off. I remember Oliver screaming, "I can't breathe." And Tobe Hooper and I thought it was great acting. When I asked him to scream, he screamed better than Janet Leigh in Psycho. So here Tobe is yelling, "More, more." And I'm saying, "Great, Oliver, look towards the camera." And suddenly I saw his face turn crimson. First of all, that's a quote about choking a child. Because they didn't realize what was happening. But the part that I want to point out in that quote is that it indicates that he is on equal footing with Hooper.
It sounds like
set.
they're tag teaming the directing job.
Because he's calling out direction to one of the film's main actors. Here's another interview from Film Comment. Here's a quote. "All I can say about my involvement overall is I wrote the movie. I actually wrote Poltergeist, but co-authored an earlier draft with Michael Grace and Mark Victor. I hired them to realize my original idea and did a complete rewrite. And all I'll say about my involvement as line producer with Frank Marshall is that I designed the film. From the storyboards to post-production, I was the David Selznick of this movie. I functioned in a very strong way." So whether he intended it or not, and I don't know that he did. I mean, Spielberg seems like a good dude. I don't know him. He seems like an okay guy. He seems like a really nice guy, honestly, in interviews. But also, I don't know that you get to Spielberg's level of power without being a nice guy with being a nice guy all the time, right?
It's the hard part with this whole story because I want to like Steven Spielberg, and I do. And I mean, and these guys, by the way, are ended on good terms. But the thing is. Yeah, that David Selznick guy, for those that don't know, he produced like Gone with the Wind and like ended up purchasing like Margaret Mitchell's novel, did that thing. And I forget the other movie now.
Wizard of Oz?
No, I was thinking of another one later. Anyway,
it
doesn't matter. The point is that he essentially coined the term. No, not essentially. He did coin the term executive producer. Right. He was very involved on set with films, and Hooper kind of describes Spielberg that way too. Like he's like, well, there was still a director Gone with the Wind, and like there's, but sure, yeah, like he's very involved. He wanted to be there. Also, these guys though, they were buddies. They had known each other a long time. Yeah, they had been talking about this movie and tossing ideas back and forth constantly.
Leading up to
the production, they were just excited. And even though Steven Spielberg was doing E.T., he wanted to be on set just because this is a thing he's been playing with.
He's a very enthusiastic guy.
Yeah,
he is.
But it does suck that then he's like, it does feel like there's this part of him that is just like,
he wants a little credit.
Let's let him think it.
Yeah.
Whatever. Because Hooper ends up writing the LA Times. And he was disturbed when he saw this article, and he wrote a letter trying to explain what happened. And Spielberg got irate at the time because he's like, basically, he was afraid that if this came out, like what Hooper was saying, that the backers that were funding these other projects would think that Spielberg's wasting time on Poltergeist, like just chilling over on the Poltergeist set. And he told, essentially, from my understanding, he kind of told Hooper to keep his mouth shut, and the relationships kind of got strained for a little while there.
Yeah, and whether he intended it or not, like the quote, like the one, the David Selznick quote, it does minimize Hooper's creative involvement with the film. Like that, if you read it at face value, that's what it sounds like. And remember, it was Hooper who had the idea to make a movie about poltergeist in the first place. Spielberg wanted to make an alien invasion movie. And Spielberg may have drafted the original story, but the idea was Hooper's from the get-go. And plus, Spielberg says that he co-authored an earlier draft with Michael Grace and Mark Victor. Well, Grace and Victor got co-screenwriting credit on this from the WGA. So even if Spielberg, rewrote a lot of it, there's enough of their ideas in the film for them to be given a co-writing credit. And then there's the case of a guy named Paul Clemens and Bennett Michael Yellen, who were two screenwriters who filed a $37 million lawsuit saying that Spielberg had used elements from a screenplay that they had written in 1980. And I don't know the details of that screenplay because it's been left out of the public, but the lawsuit resulted in an out-of-court settlement in Clemens' favor. So take that as you will. And also, Spielberg reportedly requested a videotape of a Twilight Zone episode called Little Girl Lost that was written by Richard Matheson. He requested that while working on Poltergeist, and there are obvious similarities between that episode and the final film. So the reason I say all this is because, yes, Spielberg was absolutely instrumental in getting Poltergeist made. There's no arguing that. He shot some scenes. He helped in the casting process. He was heavily involved in collaborating with Jerry Goldsmith on the film's score during post-production. But movies are a collaborative art form.
Yeah.
And yes, I think Spielberg's contributions were very significant, but so were the efforts of Tobe Hooper. He was the director on the film.
It almost feels like there's these, like Spielberg's wanting to help out his buddy. He gets that Tobe Hooper's good at his job and capable, but he's also like, he's kind of fine with like, that's part of it, man. Just let it roll. Like it almost.
Well, we've also. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say maybe that's not the case, but it's just like, or the part that you have to wrap your head around is that this is Steven Spielberg's already Steven Spielberg, and Tobe Hooper needs a break. Tobe Hooper needs that opening into Hollywood, and immediately his biggest opportunity ever is overshadowed by a stupid fucking controversy.
Right. And you got to remember, I mean, it is possible that while, on set, Spielberg seemed more authoritative sometimes because we've talked about this on previous episodes. Tobe Hooper was often seen by cast and crew members as someone who was he internalized a lot. He wasn't boisterous. And then you've got a big personality like Spielberg's who's very commanding as a director. I could see how that could seem like he was more in charge. You know what I mean? Whereas Toby's more quiet and not timid, but he internalizes all of his thoughts instead of being boisterous and enthusiastic like Spielberg. That's just not who Hooper is personality wise.
Well, it's so tough, man, because we've covered these movies we've covered now, and even going back to Eaten Alive. I mean, there's the moment where Marty Rubenstein has to take over for the production because Hooper just gets in a creative difference and he walks away. And so, somebody comes on set and they're excited about working with Hooper. Hooper's not even going to be there. Hooper's not directing you because, so it's not as if Hooper is without fault, probably.
Right.
Hooper has had his moments. It's just, it sucks because he does have vision. He's what's the word I'm looking at? He's competent at doing his job. But it just, I don't know, to this day, or not to this day, but to the very last interviews you can find with Tobe Hooper, when this question gets brought up, you can just see it's just kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems like it wasn't any one particular thing, but just like you were saying, Gary, just a few things over his career that when this happened with Poltergeist,
it made it seem plausible.
Yeah, it made it seem plausible. It was, the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, and then it all kind of the snowball had already started going down the hill. So here we are.
I mean, and I'm casting a vote on this personally. I think Tobe Hooper directed the majority of the movie. I think the movie unmistakably has Spielberg's fingerprints all over it. I don't think anybody would deny that.
Right.
What I think actually happened is probably, is that I think Steven Spielberg probably reined Hooper in a little bit, because Hooper is a little bit more extreme, and this is certainly more extreme than most Steven Spielberg movies. But I feel like he may have kept Hooper, as a good producer would, kept Hooper from giving into kind of his base instincts and steering the movie into like a more scuzzy exploitation direction, that kind of the stuff he was more known for.
Right.
But then there are also moments here and there where it, without a doubt, feels like a Tobe Hooper movie. Like the scene where the guy has the kind of vision where he's peeling his own face off.
Oh yeah.
That's a Tobe Hooper moment.
It's a very
right?
Tobe
That's a Tobe
Hooper.
Hooper moment. You've got the melting face in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but there's something about this that feels more Tobe Hooper. Like there's something a little more low brow about it, I guess, just the way it looks. And then there's the skeleton stuff in the swimming pool, like at the end, like the way that it's shot, the way that he positions the camera in the swimming pool, where Joe Beth Williams is kind of drowning in the swimming pool and the skeletons are up. Like you could put that side by side with something from earlier on in Hooper's career, and they would feel more alike.
Well, I got a real Indiana Jones Well of Souls vibe from that whole thing with the skeletons in the swimming pool.
Yeah, I can see that a little bit, but it's not necessarily like the content, but there's something about, to me, the way that it's shot that feels almost like it would be at home in like a little exploitation movie.
I feel like there's definitely stuff that's dirtier than you expect from a Steven Spielberg movie.
Yes, right.
But I think when you said, Spielberg reining him in, I think there's that instance, and it's all, when a stage actor goes into film, there's always a discussion of like, hey, you don't have to play to the back of the room. The camera is 18 inches in front of your face. Like the camera will pick up those subtle things. And I think a lot of that translates to production as well. So I think that was probably along like what you were saying, Justin, like, him going, hey, look, we've got really solid characters here. We don't have to go super above on everything.
Right.
The camera's going to pick up these little nuances, and the dialogue is structured that we're going to get a very clear picture of all this stuff. So, I feel like if there were 4 quote unquote Tobe Hooper gags, there were probably initially 8 to 12, and
right. Yeah.
probably scaled those back. And I think you get a more solid movie where you can identify with the characters and go along on this journey.
Well,
I also feel like Tobe Hooper, family dynamic is Tobe Hooper's forte. Like just weird family dynamic is just kind of his deal.
Yeah, and honestly, the family dynamic in this is not like what you normally see in a Spielberg movie. Spielberg came from a family of divorce. His father left at a young age, and that informed a lot of his movies, including, Close Encounters and E.T. and in this, the father, he's kind of a doofus sometimes, but he sticks around. He does his best, and that's more in line with Tobe Hooper, I think, than a Spielberg thematically.
Well, I think a lot of the big themes in Spielberg stuff end up being like coming of age tales.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like these kids are so young, they haven't gotten there yet, but the parents are still kind of young where they've just passed that. I feel like the goofiness of the mom and dad, there's these two age groups that as a family they're having to go for. And I feel like it's a real mixture of the Tobe Hooper family structure with Steven Spielberg's coming of age.
Yeah, I could see that.
Which one do you guys attribute to the 15-year-old daughter getting threatened with rape culture by the construction workers in the front yard and the mom laughing it off when she shoots the bird?
Well, I think she's laughing it off because I think that she's proud that her daughter stood up to them, because Diane Freeling was probably about her daughter's age when she got knocked up.
Yep.
Because they say that she's 32 years old, and they say that her daughter's 16 years old. So that would have put her at 16. So maybe she's just laughing it off because she sees a little bit of herself in her daughter, but sees that her daughter is kind of essentially giving them the bird.
Yeah. I also agree that that's probably the concept behind what that scene was.
Yeah. Those guys are creepy though. And so to give Spielberg a little bit of, some of those quotes I read make him seem like a bad guy, kind of like make him seem like he was trying to take a lot of credit for the film. But you have to remember,
Steven Spielberg is a piece of shit. I am Justin Bishop, and you can quote me.
To give him a little bit of kind of leeway, this is a new situation for him as a filmmaker. He was producing a movie that he wrote, but was not the director. He had never done this. And he later said in an interview, there's a quote from Spielberg: "Turmoil is created by wanting to do it your own way and having to go through procedure. I will never again not direct a film I write. It was frustrating for Tobe Hooper, and it was frustrating for the actors who were torn between my presence and his on set every day. But rather than Tobe saying, 'Get off the set,' he'd laugh and I'd laugh. And if he'd said, 'I've got some ideas you're really not letting into this movie, don't be on the set,' I probably would have left." So it's kind of a thing with Spielberg where he's like, I'm not used to being on set and not being the guy answering all the questions. He's never done this before. He would do it again later. He would do it with Joe Dante very soon after this, but it's a new experience for him. And I could see that there being a period of adjustment where you just on instinct, you're like, I'm going to, jump in on this.
Well, you would tell the stories about like somebody would, kind of what you were just saying. I mean, I definitely saw stuff from Spielberg where, they'd ask how we do a certain thing. He would say like, well, what you could do is this. And he'd look over at Tobe, and Tobe would like nod. And so he's like, all right, well, then that's what we're doing. Like Tobe, what we keep saying, he internalizes, but you also have to think, I mean, probably on the other side, and this is not disputing what you just said, this is kind of adding to it, is that Toby's probably like, this guy just got me the biggest opportunity in my entire life.
Right.
So I'm not gonna
step on his toes.
Yeah, I'm not gonna fight with him about it.
Yeah. So the whole issue of who actually directed the film got so out of hand that the Directors Guild of America had to step in and launch an investigation to determine whether Hooper was, quote, being demeaned by having his status as a director reduced to mechanical rather than creative tasks. So this investigation was launched when these trailers for the movie came out that showed footage of Spielberg directing on set and advertising it as a Steven Spielberg film, while in smaller letters it acknowledged that Tobe Hooper was the actual director of the film. So as part of the investigation, Hooper was forced to respond, and he had said he had done fully half of the movie storyboards himself and had totally directed the picture, a sentiment that was echoed by many of the actors in the film. And then the DGA did end up siding with Hooper on that, and they fined Steven Spielberg $15,000 and also demanded that those trailers be pulled.
Spielberg carries that in his wallet, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
One requirement of that arbitration was that Spielberg had to make a public statement on the matter. So an ad was taken out in Variety, but even that statement didn't really clear things up, because in the ad, Spielberg said that Hooper had directed the film wonderfully and thanked Hooper for allowing him, quote, as a producer and writer, a wide berth of creative involvement. So it's kind of like a backhanded apology almost. I don't know. It's a really weird phrasing, but the question of who directed Poltergeist still rages on. I mean, we're almost 40 years from the release of this film, and people are still talking about it. We're still talking about it, but it has been a continuous source of conversation since 1982. In a 2007 interview with Ain't It Cool News, remember them?
Yeah.
Zelda Rubinstein said that, quote, Steven directed all 6 days that she was on set. She said, Tobe set up the shots and Steven made the adjustments. She also said that Hooper, quote, allowed some unacceptable chemical agents into his work. That is most likely a reference to Hooper's alleged cocaine habit at this time, which is another thing that some people have attributed to why Spielberg may have had to step in if Hooper was indeed coked out a lot of the time. And I don't know how much truth there is to that, but that's another point of conversation when people are discussing this.
In the last movie is so weird. I did see a comment from one of the actors talking about Hooper was a huge cokehead, but then they said like he drank like 12 Coca-Colas a day,
Yeah.
Maybe they really did mean I don't know.
Yeah, that was the guy who played the Barker in the movie, Conway.
Yeah, that's right. It was Conway. And the other thing is that just if I could throw in here really quick, an important detail I think is back to Ain't It Cool News. In the remake of Texas Chainsaw, Harry Knowles, his severed head is one of the heads down in the basement with Texas. And that's very important. You just wanted to share that trivia.
I did.
Since you brought up Ain't It Cool News.
He's also in The Faculty as a member of the faculty that is only a background character. So there you go. Now, those are Harry Knowles' two big film moments. We shall never speak his name on this podcast again.
I was about to say, interestingly enough, what's cool is art imitating life. There are lots of people that would love to see Harry Knowles' head on a table. I'm not encouraging that, by the way. If anybody ever pulls this up, I feel like that was a clip that's going to be on CNN one day. And I'm not saying that.
Isolate that audio, please.
Little did we know how much involvement this little podcast from South Carolina would have in this case.
Oh, man. So anyway, Zelda Rubinstein said that for some reason in an interview later, but other cast members have pretty much unanimously come to the side of Hooper. So Rue Morgue magazine, the horror magazine, did a 30th anniversary article on Poltergeist, 2012. And James Karen said, Tobe had a hard time on that film. It's tough when a producer's on set every day, and there's always been a lot to talk about that. I consider Tobe my director. And he also wondered why Zelda Rubinstein kind of threw Hooper under the bus. He's like, I don't know why they were always like, he was always good to her. I don't know why she would have said that. But in that same interview,
another quote from him where he was like, Zelda Rubinstein's a bitch.
In that same interview, several other cast and crew members expressed similar sentiments, saying that Tobe Hooper directed this movie. Mm-hmm. Then back in 2017, just a few years ago, Annabelle director John Leonetti appeared on the Shockwaves podcast to promote his new movie, Wish Upon. So in addition to being the director of such classics as Annabelle and Mortal Kombat Annihilation, Leonetti has had a long career as a cameraman and cinematographer. His older brother, Matt Leonetti, was in fact the cinematographer on Poltergeist.
Ooh. Well, at least I know now who to blame for the death of Johnny Cage in the second Mortal Kombat movie.
And so John Leonetti, who would have been about 25 at the time, he was a camera assistant on Poltergeist, pulling focus for his brother. As a focus puller, he would have been on set for nearly every shot, or at least the major shots of the film. So on the Shockwaves podcast, when the subject of Poltergeist came up, host Elric Kane flat out asked him who directed Poltergeist. And his quote, he said, quote, candidly, Steven Spielberg directed that movie. There is no question. And yet, the story continues. In response to Leonetti's statement, director Mick Garris on his own podcast, Postmortem, I'm sure we'll talk about Mick Garris on this show. He's directed 100 Stephen King adaptations. But
Mick Garris has his own Postmortem, has a sit down with Tobe Hooper, and that's where I got a ton of information from.
Yeah, and so the statement that I'm going to read from him came after Tobe Hooper passed away, and not long after he passed away, they were doing a kind of memorial episode, and the subject came up. So Garris, he may not have been there for every shot of the film, but he spent a significant time on the set of Poltergeist because he was doing publicity for the film. So here's what he said on his own podcast. Yes, I would see him climb on the camera and say, maybe we should push in on a 2-shot here or do this, that, there. And Tobe would be watching. Tobe was always calling action and cut. Tobe had been deeply involved in all of the pre-production and everything. But Steven is a guy who will come in and call the shots. And so you're on your first studio film, hired by Steven Spielberg, who's enthusiastically involved in this movie. Are you going to say, stop that, let me do this? Which Tobe did. Then he continues later in the kind of making his point a little more clear. He says, quote, Tobe directed that movie. Steven Spielberg had a lot to do with directing that movie too. That controversy still hangs there, but Tobe is so much a crucial part of that movie. Tobe was a terrific filmmaker. I don't think Steven was controlling. I think Steven was enthusiastic. And nobody was there to protect Tobe. But all the pre-production was done by Tobe. Tobe was there throughout. Tobe's vision is very much realized there, and Tobe got credit because he deserved credit. yes, Steven Spielberg was very much involved, but it's a Tobe Hooper film.
Man, it's tough. I really do lean. I just keep coming back to thinking that it's just these guys not thinking of all of this other bullshit in a way. Now later,
just
what
working
happened
together? They're just working together, and it's a collaboration, you know. And they're not saying, oh, the director should do this or oh, the producer should do that. They're just trying to get the job done and get the best movie as possible.
Even Mick Garris's quote that you're mentioning there, it just seems like he's kind of like, there should have been like an agent for Tobe Hooper there to say,
well, normally the producer's the
yourself.
one. A lot of times the producer's the one who's protecting the director from like the studio, but in this case, Spielberg is the producer.
But he's almost saying there should be somebody going, hey, watch yourself. It's going to look like Steven Spielberg's doing this. Don't let him take charge.
Right.
Don't let him take charge. Just like you see in every fucking dramatic teen movie or whatever, like just, oh, this guy's thinking this about you, you better do something. And and these guys are just two guys that love movies, and they've been just like batting around ideas. Now I will say, I mean, it does seem like a little bit, and maybe Steven Spielberg's just trying to cover his ass from getting sued by another studio,
the DGA.
Yeah, or the DGA. So he's just like, Toby, shut the fuck up for a second. And I don't know. It's just a complicated situation. I don't think that I think it was probably as simple as these were two guys just having fun making a movie, not thinking at all about the consequences that were going to come from it and dealing with it afterwards.
Right.
The annoying part for me here is that what happens with Tobe Hooper that I think it's important people understand is that at this time in his life, he is dealing with, he'd been accused of being like the most devious of shitty filmmakers, like just with Texas Chainsaw, just like you just wrote and made like bullshit cinema. By the time this movie comes out, actually, based on everything I can find, the lawsuits had wrapped up that we talked about all before with
on the
like,
Texas Chainsaw
stuff.
Okay.
Like all that was clearing up. Like those things were rounding out. Texas Chainsaw was starting to be appreciated around this time. Mostly like, it was getting re-released in like drive-ins, and it had gotten finally approved. And I remember in France, and like it came out, it like made more money than Superman or something. I remember on the
Texas
like
Chainsaw
first
made
showing
more than Superman
like,
in France.
Yeah, and it was just it was insane. Like Texas Chainsaw, just since you mentioned that, is just, it is possibly the most profitable independent film of all time. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows because the records were shit.
Yeah, you can't
And
just ask
money was being
gangsters or
laundered through the
mafia.
mob.
To, like, you can't just ask them to open their books and show you. But it's quite possible that it was the most profitable independent film of all time. It's pretty heavily likely that it was. But nobody knows. And so he went from making this movie that is just now starting in 82 to become like a well-known name for a horror movie and a well-appreciated name. But at the time he's making this movie, it's right in that period where it's like going from this movie was porno to like this movie is a classic.
Right.
And
it's being reassessed. Now, I mean, it was very popular when it first came out, but I think what you mean is it's kind of being reassessed as seen as more than just a quick buck horror movie, like that it is actually legitimately a excellent film.
Right. So here's this guy who thinks that he's taking, obviously we're talking about just from this controversy, Tobe Hooper is not going to have things work out well for him. People are not going to truly appreciate him, but he's a guy who's definitely probably produced like on 2 movies, made classics and over $100 million on like the money that's going to like come in for these movies. And he's still, because of this shit that he keeps having to deal with, is going to be the guy that's continuously going to be asked to prove yourself. Like, what can you do? Like, no, this is different. Like,
well, I mean, where do you guys stand as far as like, Do you think this is a Tobe Hooper movie? Like, or do you think this is that Spielberg ghost directed most of it? I mean, I think you from what I've said, I think it's clear where I stand on it. But what do you guys think? I mean, what side of that line do you fall on?
For myself, I fall on that movies are a collaborative effort, just like what we talked about earlier. I mean, that's generally where I fall. Where in a time right now, we can appreciate a name like Tobe Hooper. We should be celebrating the fact that there was a time that Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg teamed up and made a movie. At the end of the day, at worst, that's what you can say about Poltergeist. And it's like, that's pretty fucking good.
Yeah.
That's what you should accept. It's like, it doesn't even matter. You know, it should be cool. What sucks about it is that there were people during the time that took away from Tobe Hooper because of that very fact. But it's like, you know, when we get into later collaborations with people or like a certain, I don't know, like you want to get into like Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven team up. It's like, now we can look back and be like, fuck yeah, that's gold. Like, why wouldn't that work? And, but it's tough. Like you should appreciate these great pairings and collaborative efforts of screenwriters. I think that Tobe Hooper was the director. Steven Spielberg was just there and helped, and people. But it was also peak Spielberg time,
right?
And so people just saw Steven Spielberg and were probably, you know, he was the Shane Black, Quentin Tarantino of this point in history, probably, like where they were just like, oh, Steven's at it again. He's fucking shit up in Hollywood.
That's an exact quote, I believe, from the.
Yeah, I think that was in the LA Times article.
That was in Variety or something. Yeah.
What do you think? Where do you stand, Todd? What side of the line do you fall on?
I think I stated a little bit my thoughts and feelings earlier in the show, but to reiterate and expand a little bit, I feel like, yeah, you've got the big dog and you've got the little dog, and
Roman Reigns.
Huh?
There's the wrestling reference. I love it.
There you go. There it is.
I did that for you, Gary.
Thanks.
So I feel like there's little dog's in charge, and something comes up of how do we get this shot, and Spielberg gives his 2 cents, which at this point his 2 cents is worth about $2,000. So they're gonna say, yeah, we should probably go with what he says. And even him looking to Tobe to get the nod of approval to seasoned crew that's been doing this stuff, and with everything in the press and their careers thus far, it can really seem like Steven had the reins. The part that I thought was how much this would have been exacerbated today with social media. If some of those things had leaked, to Twitter, to Instagram, of, Steven pointing and telling someone, hey, go do the thing over there, how that photo would have been on the front, on, the top right under the headline of every article coming out. As it stands, I feel like any of the work that I've been lucky enough to be a part of and seen that collaborative effort knows, I feel like I know that, yeah, it's any idea and every idea. But when you've got the idea machine as your producer, that's where you're going to get a lot of those ideas from. But at the same time, the director has to be able to step up and say,
he's the final say. He's the final
say.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Tobe asserted himself,
and we'll never know.
Yeah. And we'll never know. So I think if there's a question, I think it's not necessarily of Steven's involvement, but of Tobe's assertiveness and how much he projected we've talked about it before, that there's definitely an ego that comes along with directing and being in charge, and how much Tobe put that, and made that known to cast, crew, the press, whoever, I think is actually the question here, because look, you got a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg. Of course he wants to have his hands in it. He's been doing it since he was a kid.
Well,
Of
bro,
course he's
the
gonna
other
wanna do
thing,
that
I don't know
stuff.
why I said bro like a jerk, but like the other part is like, I think that even works that same way, Todd, is exactly what you're saying. Just to jump in there, is that even for the cast, like maybe that even like, so the way it just hit me just now as Todd was talking, like that this even plays out, is that imagine you're entering the show Hell's Kitchen and you're trying to be like a badass chef, and Gordon Ramsay is like the guy judging your shit. And Gordon Ramsay, you finally make it through, you win Hell's Kitchen and you start a restaurant. Gordon Ramsay approves and you're there. You're in the big time. Like, you've got a restaurant. Like, you're the man. But the day that Gordon Ramsay comes in and is like hanging out in the kitchen, like kind of guiding, like walking along and like just checking things out, even the staff, the customers, everybody, they're going to be like, I was in the place that Gordon Ramsay was at.
Yeah. Gordon Ramsay was the chef.
Right.
Yeah.
Gordon Ramsay was there. Even if Gordon Ramsay is just trying to be like, I'm just checking things out.
Yeah.
And, like maybe I've got some advice here or there. Even if you were like the dude who won Hell's Kitchen, you're still going to play second fiddle to Gordon Ramsay being in the building.
Right.
Well, so to me, the question of whether this is truly a Tobe Hooper film boils down to, I think, the tone of the film. Because it is, yes, it looks and has has elements of that are familiar with like a Spielberg film. But first of all, it's a balls to the wall horror film, which Steven Spielberg has never done. He's had elements of horror in his movies, but he's not a horror movie director. But more than that,
Unless
I think
you count E.T.
Well, unless either of your wives discuss E.T.
Right.
But even more than that, this is a satire of like suburban life, of the American dream. And Steven Spielberg, first of all, he doesn't do satire. He is a great filmmaker. Spielberg is possibly one of the greatest. I mean, definitely one of the greatest who will ever live. But he doesn't do satire. He is a sincere filmmaker. When he makes a movie, like you know what it's about. There's no subversiveness. There's not a hidden message lying under it. Like when he's talking about, when he makes a Saving Private Ryan, it's about the exact experience that these soldiers are having.
Right.
Poltergeist, though, is a satire, and it's a movie that quite literally equates the television with evil. It begins and ends with an image of a television. At the beginning, it shows, the very first shot in the movie is Carol Ann staring at the television, or it's actually the static of the television, and it zooms out. And then on multiple occasions, you see the television, including in that first scene, while the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner is playing, which immediately ties together the television with America or the American dream, and that's completely intentional on Hooper's part, I think. Remember, Tobe Hooper was kind of a hippie. We've talked about this on previous episodes.
Hey, your perfect suburban life was built upon the bodies of people who have died before you.
Yes, exactly. And this movie doesn't do the like Indian burial ground thing. This suburb was built on the graves of white Americans, presumably. They've got, when their skeletons pop up, they're wearing jewelry and, and modern clothes, or modernish, This was a suburb that was built on the remains of an America that used to be. And Tobe Hooper, as it's as a former, like, kind of a hippie. I mean, he's said that he wasn't a hippie, but he kind of was. This movie is very much about how the American dream, especially as we moved into the 80s, forced those counterculturalists, the hippies and the counterculturalists of the 60s, kind of turned them into Reaganites. It's very clear that's what's happened with Steven. We see him reading a Ronald Reagan biography, but then his wife says something along the lines when she's first showing him the phenomena: keep your mind open like it used to be. Remember when you had an open mind?
Yeah.
And then so you know that at some point he was a long-haired hippie, and at some point over time, Diane got pregnant as a 16-year-old, like we said before, they probably got forced into getting married. He had to find a job. He ends up being a real estate agent. Turns out he's very good at it. And then he becomes a yuppie. He turned from a hippie to a yuppie. That's what happened. That's what happened to a lot of boomers, and that's kind of what Tobe Hooper's saying here, that these guys, they kind of, this new America that is fully built on capitalism, essentially, because that's what Stephen Freeling is. He sells cookie cutter houses that literally all look the same. He even admits that he can't tell one from the other. He's selling a product, but he's doing so by destroying the America that used to be.
Well, and just like building right on top of them. I mean, there's even that specific line at the end where it's like, you just removed the tombstones. You didn't even remove the bodies. Like you just were like, if we removed the symbol basically of the thing.
Exactly.
Like,
they don't even care enough.
Yeah.
Nobody cares enough.
We changed the facade. So
yeah. And frankly, it's kind of unfortunate that we have to spend so much time talking about the controversy of this, because we spent a long time talking about that. But you can't talk about Poltergeist without talking about that, because it is a huge part of the conversation of the film.
Sadly, we're in a specific spot where we have to decide which road to go down on this, because clearly there's deeper aspects of the movie itself to discuss, and there's also the story we're telling here.
Yes, yeah. And the thing is, the whole controversy, it was very much the talk of the industry in the summer of 1982. But general audiences who were seeing like the trailer as the film was getting ready to come out, they didn't give a shit who directed the movie. They didn't care about this controversy. It wasn't, they saw Steven Spielberg's name. Yes, that's a selling point, but this controversy is not like national news. You're not seeing this on 2020 or whatever the hell show was on at the time, So when the film was released, it was released on June 4th, 1982. It got a PG rating after an appeals process, because it originally got an R rating. They appealed to the MPAA, got it pushed back to a PG. This was kind of one of about 3 or 4 movies, all of which involved Steven Spielberg, that helped to create the PG-13 rating. But it got a PG-13 or a PG rating, and it was a monster hit, although not quite as big a hit as the other movie that came out on that same day, which was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
There's your Star Trek reference.
Nice.
Todd. Actually, if you want another Star Trek reference, Matthew Leonetti, the cinematographer, he has had a very long career as a cinematographer, but he was also the director of photography on Star Trek First Contact and Insurrection.
Nice. My favorite and least favorite Star Trek movies.
So in its first weekend, it grossed about $6.8 million. And by the time of its Halloween reissue in October, it had grossed more than $70 million. I think about $76 million.
Nice.
And its success led to sequels. There's Poltergeist 2, came out in 1985. Poltergeist 3 came out in 1988. That one was directed by Gary Sherman, who we will be discussing in depth in another episode in a couple of weeks. And there was even a TV series called Poltergeist: The Legacy that aired from 96 to 99. There was a remake that came out in 2015 with Sam Rockwell.
And Bella Thorne.
Yeah, it's pretty forgettable, honestly. It's
not if you've seen Bella Thorne. No, but I will say they had an idea for a sequel. What was interesting to me is like I was so happy to stumble upon some stuff with Tobe Hooper talking about it, that they had, he and Steven were still excited during this whole process. So again, this is before that, probably until the release of this movie, Tobe Hooper's feeling pretty fucking good. Like he's like, oh, Texas Chainsaw's getting re-released. It's in the drive-ins. It's hitting in like, I think it had a big re-release I saw in the US in like May, and then again around Halloween. And like, so it was like Texas Chainsaw is like starting to be appreciated. And then, yeah, like in France, like it's big release there. And so he's starting to be appreciated. And then he's on this big movie, this big blockbuster movie. So he and Spielberg were like kicking around ideas. They had this idea that I saw him describe it specifically, that it was like the opening scene is like, you hear like a click, click, click sound, like just these click, click, click. And then you see like ropes being drawn down, and there's like clamps. And essentially long story short, he describes it in more perfect detail in some random French interview I saw. But it's basically the National Guard is in the neighborhood that this movie just took place in, and they have just like sealed off the whole neighborhood. And there's a fire truck like pulled up to where the house like crumples up into, and there's a floating orb like that's there. And the clinking is the ladder of the fire truck going into the orb, and like people chaining themselves to each other, and they're about to like explore the other side, basically.
Oh, wow. That sounds wild.
Nice.
And it sounded awesome. I was like, what the fuck is this? This sounds great.
I wonder why they didn't go with that idea when they finally decided to do
it was like the writers just, well, he said that MGM like kind of crumbled around this time. And
because the guys who wrote this, Michael Grace and Mark
they
Victor,
picked it back up and ran with it for like Poltergeist 2.
Right.
They ended up like taking their ideas and like, we'll just build on this. We'll go with like I think he said like a Jim Jones cult idea. And let's move into part 2.
So they've got the old man, the old Reverend Kane, the creepy old man in the second one.
Yeah. And so for Hooper, he was saying that like MGM crumbled like around this time and Spielberg was out, and he was like, well, then fuck it. Like I'm not in it either. Yeah. And so, but he was like, we had like storied it out. Like we were going into like a scientific, he was like, maybe it was ambitious, but he was like, that's what we thought. It was the next stage was like a scientific exploration of the other side.
That's kind of cool. I mean, Poltergeist 2 as it exists is fine. I mean, it's got some good stuff in it. It's got some really gnarly creature work. H.R. Giger actually designed some of the creatures in that, and it's worth checking out. I watched it a few days ago because
that priest guy is super fucking creepy.
He's super creepy, yeah. But yeah, some of the creature design and practical effects, especially in the last like act of the movie, are pretty damn cool. I mean, other than that, the movie's it doesn't hold a candle to the first one. It's not nearly as well directed, but it's an all right sequel. The third one is a little. I haven't seen the third one in years, but I remember not being terribly impressed by it.
It's so funny. I saw like quotes from like Heather O'Rourke. She like went along because she stuck with it. God bless her.
Yeah, she's in all 3 of them.
But she would say in like quotes later, I really liked the first one. That was a really fun movie and it was exciting. And I only saw the second one once or twice because it made me like go to sleep or something like that. It was like, it's too bad. It's too bad. But it's she seemed very honest. He was very young. So,
well, the original Poltergeist was not only a financial success, but was a critical success. I mean, critics loved it and it made several top 10 lists that year. But, as we always do, we like to look at alternate viewpoints on this show. So I would like to know, Gary, what have we found out regarding internet critics on this film?
Well, Justin, as always, there are many critics online and some people that just get real fired up about any particular movie you want to bring up. There's somebody who's passionately on the other end and wants to hate it just with a fiery passion that only exists in the loins of my wife.
I don't know where this conversation's going.
Anyway. Where are we talking about? What are we talking about? No, that definitely when you talk about Poltergeist, there are some people that tried to approach it as a horror movie and then it sounds like they were disappointed. And anyway, somebody needs a nap. So the good part I could say about this movie is that for the most part, when you go searching for bad reviews, as I do, because it's my job, most people are just disappointed with the fucking fact that there is not a good release of this movie. That is just like...
That is disappointing, but no reflection on the quality of the movie itself.
No, but I mean, people will straight up on Amazon give it 1 star and they're like, what is this piece of shit version of Poltergeist? There's no special features. There's no,
Part 2 and 3 both got the Shout Factory treatment. But the first one, it's a bare bones $5 Blu-ray.
Yeah, I mean, like literally, I mean, I almost used this one. Now I'm technically going to, so I apologize to whoever put it up there. But it was like the tagline is they're here, but not talking about special features.
Stupid.
And so like people are just disappointed that there's no like really comprehensive like release of Poltergeist.
Yeah, there should be.
Perfecting everything. So, but there were people that just legitimately seem to hate the fucking movie. And I have those. Here's Mark Steven Tipton. He says, I hate this movie in all caps. Does anyone else agree that this movie is just god awful? I mean, it just sucks. It isn't. I'm speaking like he's as drunk as I am. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. All of a sudden, there's a clown fighting a little boy in a tree, and then a big gaping hole in the closet. It looks like the inside of a whale. What the heck? And what was with that kid sliding on the floor? The St. Louis Rams helmet. It sounds like I'm drunk and I just can't read this, but I swear to God, I'm reading it verbatim. Don't get me started with that helmet. Why did they choose the Rams? They didn't live in California. I know that the Rams used to be in Los Angeles Rams, but they can't have them. They're a little more up to date. This might be the worst movie I've ever seen. If you have never seen this movie, don't waste your money. Get a better horror movie like Batman or Halloween. This movie sucks.
Did he say Batman?
Madman.
Oh, Madman.
And
why is
when he
so
said
fixated
have,
on the...
it was with multiple A's, so I wasn't just like slurring.
Why was he so fixated on the helmet of the Rams helmet?
He was real fixated on it.
Yeah.
This is
All right,
a
what else you
Movie
got?
Freak, which we have a friend who uses that.
Maybe it's him.
Maybe it's him. This
Maybe it's
movie
Andrew.
sucks. Family who live in a house located over a graveyard are terrorized by a haunting force who makes life for them a living hell and kidnaps their daughter. Though the clown attack near the end is really scary, this movie is a mess of living dead, aliens, ghosts, storms, you name it. A mess entirely. Boo! This is from... This is another one.
I think every negative review should end with boo. And a thumbs down emoji.
This movie is this review is titled Poltergeist, a travesty.
Travesty? Is there an R in there?
It's a travesty. I've become thoroughly disillusioned when misty swirls emanated from the TV. This film doesn't just have cheesy effects. It comes across as a parody of what it should have been. The family seemed pretty unconcerned. There was a period after period. The family seemed pretty unconcerned about the unnatural occurrences. If chairs start moving by themselves across a room, surely anyone would rush out and try to get professional help. At times, I thought this could be a Disney production for kiddies. The acting was pretty lustre. The strongest reactions I had to this film were disbelief that the producers could try to present such silly effects, and also I had to laugh at the ineptitude of the acting. This is best categorized as a feeble comedy.
What?
And this is this review is from a person named Chandler, who I assume is Chandler from Friends, which makes sense because the subject is
could it be anymore?
Even reviewing the same movie? I am in total shock that this movie has such high reviews. It was horrible in every way. The plot was terribly boring and worthy of the harshest ridicule. The overly dramatic, cheesy acting served only to make this film even more absurd, which I thought the plot did a good enough job of doing. The terrible special effects, which perhaps were acceptable when the movie was made, were the icing on this already crap cake. They seemed as though their main purpose was to make up for what the entire rest of the movie lacked. Perhaps the other reviewers are simply reviewing this movie based on nostalgia, but I find it hard to believe that it is worth more than one stare, I assume he means star, one stare, and a permanent place in the $1 bin at Walmart. I was under the impression that it was supposed to be some sort of super cheesy horror comedy. But even if that were the case, it fails on both accounts. I won't go into specifics on exactly which segments exemplify my previous comments.
Like a good reviewer would.
Nay, I think it's glaringly obvious. So there's Chandler's.
Oh, man. So I have to ask then, we've gotten the takes from the internet. We've, Gary, we've all kind of given a little bit of our 2 cents on this, but I want to hear Todd's take.
I mean, to boil it down,
because you've been kind of hit and miss on Toby.
Yeah,
mostly miss.
I mean,
you thought Funhouse was okay.
Funhouse was okay. I liked Salem's Lot.
We're back at 50%, right?
Right. Yeah, I did enjoy this. I think.
Have you seen this before? Was this the first time? First time watch.
This was a first viewing. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. Poltergeist. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think Steven Spielberg's involvement would help any movie.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Jurassic Park 2.
Well, yeah, there you go. I thought the characters were easily identifiable, and you could really get into through very little effort. It was easy to know who they are, what their deal is, and for me to care about them.
Which is important, honestly, in a movie like this, because if you've got a bunch of characters in peril, you need to care about. Yep. And that's not always the case in a horror movie. I mean, there are certainly horror movies where the victims are despicable, but those are going for something different than I think what a movie like this is going for. In a horror movie like this, you need to care about, I think, the characters.
There's probably some discussion for later for all of us where, like, I bet there's some discussion about Steven Spielberg probably redefined what a movie is for an entire audience of people. So there's also that aspect of it. Like, I bet Steven Spielberg kind of defined what you expect from a film.
Yeah. I will say, and I mean, if this is any indicator, this movie, even over everything else that we've watched in this Tobe Hooper series, this movie, when it was done, I sought out the trailers for the sequels. And I was kind of like, this was a lot of fun. I'd stick with this franchise. I really enjoyed it.
It's honestly a great concept. I mean, it's not often that you see, especially at this time, there weren't a lot of haunted house movies out that were, I mean, there were like, we mentioned The Haunting earlier, and obviously earlier ones like, I guess, House on Haunted Hill, the William Castle movie you could consider, but it wasn't generally like a super popular genre, although the ones that had existed before were more they were old Gothic castles and things like that. This was bringing it into modern suburbia, bringing that same kind of.
And the funny thing about it, again, for me, trying to compare this to other things I've seen, I felt like this was, because they approached it so scientifically, I felt like this ended up being, instead of trying to figure out who the poltergeists are and what's the thing that they need to appease their souls, it almost became more of a survival.
Because what you eventually find out is that the main poltergeist is the beast, which may very well be the fucking devil himself.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, if I could just say, looks pretty fucking good.
Yeah.
Looked really good.
I love that effect. I love it.
And it was survival, but it was also kind of, like I said, because they approached it so scientifically, there was an element of it's a puzzle to solve.
Yeah.
And
which makes it compelling as a narrative.
Yeah. And again, I feel like when you've got characters who are, sort of an everyman or the average family, you can kind of sit yourself next to them and be like, yeah, let's figure this out. And it just further takes you into that story, and you go on that journey with them.
Yeah. And I think for me, I'll go ahead and say, I think one of the all-time great haunted house movies. I think the way that it's structured is so good. I mean, they do not dilly-dally. There's no wasting time. You start off with that opening scene where Carol Ann has been called to the television. That's kind of almost like a cold open. Then you get to know the family, and there's this great shot that I think is I would have to guess is a Spielberg idea, because it feels like a Spielberg idea, but where the golden retriever walks from room to room.
Yep.
And it shows you the layout of the house, which is going to be very important later on in the movie, and it lets you meet every single member of the family.
Yep.
And like this one great scene where the golden retriever's walking from person to person. It's really great. You get to know the whole family. You get to kind of know their dynamic. You get some banter between the husband and wife, the daughter, the older daughter, and then the manifestations of the haunting start out pretty quickly with the chairs in the kitchen. And then,
which was the way they did that was
the in camera,
bro,
yeah.
But
I want to see behind the scenes footage of that.
I saw Toby talking about that, where he was just super stoked about that one as being one of his favorite effects. Like, just the idea that he was like, I arranged this as more like a magic trick than an actual effect. It was that, and he talked about it, like just we followed the mom. We had like a group of guys there ready to pull the chairs out.
Yeah. And bring in this other structure.
And bring in the structure of the chairs like stacked on each other. So like we follow her. And so like there were people hiding in the cabinets, like ready to go.
Yeah.
And so like as it pans over, you give the signal, they move in, they pull out the chairs.
I just want to see the footage of these guys scrambling in to grab it. And I think it would be great to see a great behind the scenes. Yeah.
I felt myself like listening. I was like, do I hear a bump or anything? Like just,
but those initial manifestations are small, like they're kind of playful, and you've got Diane, JoBeth Williams doing the little kind of experiments and stuff, but then shit hits the fan pretty quickly. Like at first it's like kind of playful little things, but the poltergeists get aggressive quickly because it's like the same day, but in the evening when the fucking tree tries to eat the child, that's like the same day that they were doing those experiments. It does not it's not like a slow build. It's just like, you're all right. You guys are in this.
Yeah. Well, I feel like an easy thing to do though would be like the immediate, as far as a horror movie goes, would be to the immediate like fright of the situation and to do like the scare factor. But one cool thing about this movie is that there is the playfulness of it. Yeah. There is like this initial, I'm just really curious what this is.
Just fascinated.
Yeah.
Like, which is kind of a Spielberg thing, because like that awe, that feeling of awe and fascination. But then Hooper immediately just says like, okay, you thought this was a Spielberg movie. No, this is a fucking Tobe Hooper movie. Yeah. And we've got a live tree that's going to try to eat a child.
Yeah. This
20 minutes into the movie.
This stuff's trying to fuck you up. Like, don't play with it. But it's just interesting to see like that dichotomy, like the family wants to play around with it for a second. They're just interested, but I don't know. It's dude, I think that a lot of ghost movies, if not from this time on, at least in this time now, that succeed, pull from this movie. Like if you were going to take anything that like
The Conjuring.
I was about to say anything that James Wan does is exactly from this style of movie. James Wan definitely loves to play with the family aspect. And in this situation, he takes it to another level. But I mean, that's just the benefit of just being the next stage in this progression. Insidious and The Conjuring are definitely playing with this exact sort of storytelling.
Yeah. And I think that as a horror film, I think this is incredibly effective. I mean, it's got some pretty terrifying scenes. I mean, how many children are scared of clowns because of this movie? Like it's got some, and then that stuff at the end is like, with the skeletons and stuff, like that's some pretty gnarly stuff for a PG rated, horror movie.
I saw an interviewer ask Toby about the clown. They're like, why'd you decide on the clown? Oh, he's like, well, clowns are scary. And they were like, really? And he's like, yes. Yep. Like, it's just like, they just are.
They are. And I already touched on this earlier, but I think it it doesn't hurt to discuss it further. I don't think Tobe Hooper's social commentary is on the same level as someone like George Romero, but it's definitely a bigger aspect of Hooper's work than a lot of people give it credit for. I don't think it gets discussed quite enough. I mean, before now, I think it was probably most readily apparent in Chainsaw. We talked a little bit about that during that episode, but I think Poltergeist social commentary is even more clear and apparent, probably more than any other movie of his career. And the ironic part of that is that he's making this for a giant corporation, because a lot of his commentary in this one is sort of lampooning 1980s Reaganism, capitalism, and consumerism and suburbia, which of course, Steven Spielberg is, that's another fact. Steven Spielberg adores suburbia, so he's not going to lampoon it the way that Tobe Hooper does. Remember, Tobe Hooper is from Texas. And then I'd say the film also has this weird structuring thing that I know that Hooper's working from a script that Spielberg worked on, but Hooper did also do the edit of this. He spent 10 months editing this movie. And there's this weird structuring thing to the movie that somehow feels unusual, and which makes me attribute it to Tobe Hooper. And one of the parts of that is that it has two finales. It has two final acts, essentially, because there's the logical one that's driven by the plot that ends in Tangina, saying this house is clean. They've rescued Carol Ann, which was all the mom, by the way. The men in this movie are kind of mostly useless. The dad's kind of useless. It's Jo Beth Williams who's she's the one who has to go in and get Carol Ann. The paranormal investigator and then the medium are both women, but all Craig T. Nelson has to do is hold on to the rope while his wife goes into the other side of into the other side, and he drops the fucking rope.
Yeah.
He's like a fucking doofus.
Well, this goes all the way back to the 6 Degrees of Kill Bill series, where we're where he's pitching the idea that no genre films are where women are important.
Yeah,
women.
This is Jo Beth Williams's movie. I mean, she's the hero of the movie. Anyway, but you've got the plot. This ending. The house is clean, which again is not to beat a dead horse, but in a Steven Spielberg movie, that's your ending. Everyone lives happily ever after. Whatever the malevolent spirits are have been satisfied, and whatever was keeping them, they've gone on to the other side. Carol Ann's fine. Everybody's good. But Hooper has to kind of crank it up a little bit. And then after you think everything's fine and dad's gone back to work and everything, that second finale is 100% Tobe Hooper. It's a fucking doozy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It begins with the previously mentioned clown coming to life and strangling a child.
Yep.
And then an unseen ghost tries to rape Diane Freeling in her bedroom and has her literally crawling up the walls. Nothing that's happened in the film so far, even at its most insane, even approaches this level of escalation, and none of this needs to be there.
Yeah,
because you could have wrapped the movie up already, but then all hell breaks loose. You've got a swimming pool full of corpses. You've got coffins shooting up out of the ground everywhere. You've got a organic tentacled portal to hell that looks like something out of David Cronenberg's Nightmares. It's great. Every moment of that finale is great, and it is intense, and it's a roller coaster ride. And narratively, none of it matters. But Tobe Hooper likes to have kind of insane endings on his movies. We talked about that in Salem's Lot. In the finale of the Funhouse is crazy. They could have just killed the monster at the end of the Funhouse, but no, he gets electrocuted and then gets crushed in the gears. He gets killed 4 times in the finale of that movie, because Tobe Hooper likes to just go out on a fucking bang.
It's like Thanksgiving with my in-laws. It's all of it's unnecessary, but literally everything you just described usually happens on Thanksgiving.
but that finale is it's very 80s. You got to end this on a huge note, very 80s filmmaking, studio filmmaking. but it works somehow. It like all works, even though you don't need it narratively, because it jacks up your adrenaline and it's just fun. It's just a fun, like, final act of the movie, I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah. As soon as the kid looks up and the clown is gone from the chair,
you're like, oh fuck.
Yeah, I let out an audible.
Remember in Scary Movie when they I think it was the first Scary Movie where they parodied that scene, but I think it was like Marlon Wayans gets sucked under the bed, but then he was like poking the clown in the butthole.
Yeah.
This is a fun game.
Hey, what are you doing? Uncle Ray Ray's got a game. Hey, get your finger out of there. Tickle, 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 tickle. Hey, you want to play with Uncle Ray?
And then the clown's trying to escape from under the bed to get away from him.
But Hooper says the hardest piece of footage to get was Mr. Rogers signing off on using footage from his show.
Oh, really? I like that one of the guys in that scene doesn't seem to know who Mr. Rogers is.
I know. He's like, who is this guy?
Who's this fucking guy? It's like, really? Mr. Rogers? You don't know who Mr. Rogers is?
I literally saw an interview where it's like, that was the hardest thing to do, is get him to sign off on.
I wonder if George Romero, who was friends with Tobe Hooper at this point, I wonder if he put in a good word or something, because
maybe
Hooper from Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Romero got to start working on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah.
So there's still more to the story of Poltergeist. We've talked a lot about Poltergeist. There's the making of the film. There's a whole controversy about who directed the film. There's, the discussion of the film itself. But if you're going to have a full discussion about all things Poltergeist, there's one more thing you have to talk about, and that's the curse of Poltergeist. And the idea that there's a curse on this movie stems primarily from the deaths of multiple cast members. In a total, 4 cast members died during or soon after the filming of various movies in the series. So for Heather O'Rourke, the little girl who plays Carol Ann, the star of the movie. I mean, she's in all the, she's the one they use in the trailer. They're here. Like she was a big part of the marketing, and she would, even if she had still continued to make movies, and even now, she would probably be forever associated with this film. But when she was young, a few years after this movie, she was misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is a disease of the intestine. It was about 1987. She was diagnosed. It was between the filming of the second and the third film of the series, which she appears in both of those. And during the filming of Poltergeist 3, she fell ill. And at first, her symptoms were attributed to the flu. But then when she collapsed and actually suffered cardiac arrest the next day after she got sick, and she got airlifted to a children's hospital. And at that children's hospital, she died during an operation to correct a bowel obstruction. And it was later found out her death was actually later attributed to a congenital stenosis of the intestine, which was a previously undetected medical condition that they just never knew she had, because she had intestinal issues. They thought it was Crohn's disease. It was something completely different, to where her insides were just bloated, and she was just essentially dying from inside out. Jeez. And so a horrible death. I mean, she apparently didn't suffer other than the pain associated with the disease, but she's 12 years old. She died at the age of 12 years old. Even if you see, like in Poltergeist 3, you can see she's not particularly well. She's got like her cheeks are really, she's got like chipmunk cheeks in the third movie. And it was actually a symptom of her sickness that they know, but her face is swollen. You could visibly see it in the film. They ended up finishing the film Poltergeist 3. Gary Sherman, the director, didn't want to finish it without her. He just couldn't bring himself to continue it, but pressure from the studio caused them to have to eventually finish it. And they had to film the entire finale with like a body double for her. And Gary Sherman never felt great about it. He still considers it his least favorite film of his career. But even earlier than that, Dominique Dunne, who played the older sister Dana in the film, she met an untimely death as well. So Dominique Dunne, she was from like a Hollywood family. Her father was an investigative journalist named Dominic Dunne. He worked for Vanity Fair, and she was the sister of actor Griffin Dunne, who's best known for playing Jack in An American Werewolf in London. So in 1981, Dunn had met a man named Thomas Sweeney. He was the sous chef at Wolfgang Puck's restaurant there in Los Angeles. After they had dated for a few months, the two moved in together, but their relationship quickly deteriorated because of Sweeney's possessiveness and jealousy. The couple would fight pretty frequently, and Sweeney eventually began physically abusing Dunn. And, she left him a couple times, kept coming back. It's the same sad story that you hear in these abusive relationships. Eventually, she left him for good. On October 30th of 1982, so a few weeks after they had completely broken up, Dunn was at her home rehearsing for a role in the miniseries V with actor David Packer, and Sweeney showed up. Thomas Sweeney showed up to her house, and she went outside to talk to him, probably try to get him to go away. And Packer, he said that he heard the couple arguing outside. He said he heard, from a quote from him, he said he heard smacking sounds, 2 screams, and a thud. He tried to call the police, but was told that that the police that he called, that this home was out of their jurisdiction. So he ends up leaving because he's like, this guy's going to kill me if I don't get out of here. He leaves through the back. And when he gets to the back, he sees Sweeney in some nearby bushes, and he's over Sweeney's on top of her. He had strangled her. And he said he doesn't remember it. He doesn't remember. He just remembers like he blacked out. And when he realized where he was on top of her with his hands around her neck.
Jeez.
And she's unconscious, but she's still alive. She's transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and placed on life support, but she never regained consciousness. And she was removed from life support on November 4th, so 5 days later. She's 22 years old. That's, again, both of those deaths are attributed to the curse of Poltergeist. And later on, the actor who played the Reverend Cain in Part 2, he died not long after filming that movie. But he had cancer, and he was very old. So that wasn't quite as unexpected, And then the Native American guy who plays the shaman in that movie, who had actually done an exorcism on the set of Poltergeist 2 to exorcise spirits from that set. He later died. I think he was having a heart transplant or something. So another death that's like not entirely unexpected.
Wow.
But the origin of the curse is said to be the real life skeletons that were used in the third act of the movie. So if you want to hear more about this, I would recommend, if you have Shudder, there's a really good show on there called Cursed Films that did a really cool episode on the Poltergeist curse. But essentially the curse, and they discussed this in the film. They actually interviewed Craig Reardon, who we haven't mentioned on this episode, but Craig Reardon is, once again, a makeup effects guy for Tobe Hooper on this movie. I think this is his third Hooper movie in a row. But the origin of that curse is said to be the real life skeletons that were used in the third act of the film. As we've discussed before, even on, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like human skeletons were often used in films because they are cheaper to buy one from like a medical supply company than just having some like artist sculpt an entire human skeleton, especially if you need a bunch of them like you do in this movie. So they just bought them from India. They bought some skeletons, And it's said people who believe in the curse of Poltergeist say that that's the reason that this movie is cursed. But there's no curse on Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, it made a lot of money. It didn't make a lot of money for the people involved, but it made a lot of money. There was no curse on Frankenstein, though. That used to, when you see, what's his name, Igor or whatever his name is, stealing the brain, he bumps into a skeleton in the little classroom. That's a real human skeleton. House on Haunted Hill, the William Castle movie, that skeleton that floats at the end of that's a real human skeleton. That's what they used in movies. It was not unusual, and none of those have curses on them. I think what happened with Poltergeist and with its sequels is it's just simply a sad series of events, tragedies.
Or they didn't use dead bodies that were tied to bullshit.
Maybe if just one of those skeletons was like a murder victim or something, then maybe. But I don't know. I don't believe in curses either. So I think it's just a sad series of coincidences.
Tobe Hooper even tells a story about like he got a cramp during like right at the first part of filming of this movie. And I see Todd laughing.
The horror.
No, he just had to poop.
Sorry.
but he describes it. He was like, no, it was one of those like because they were asking about the curse. He was like, it's funny. It's like right when we started filming, I got like this super bad cramp where it was like, for some reason, I could not walk afterwards. And he was like, my tendon was like pulled from the bone. And like, he's like, I had to go to the doctor. He's like, I used a cane most of the time that I was on the set of Poltergeist because my leg was fucked up. But he was like, I just was like, that's one of those things, like people get cramps. Like it's a weird thing. And this is just a fucked up point. He did say, he was like, but I don't know. This interview was like from 2017. He was like, at this point, maybe I am cursed.
Sure, just lean into it.
I mean, it does feel like it, honestly, for poor Tobe Hooper. Maybe he is cursed.
Well, I mean, you got to think, just the bullshit this guy's had to go through already so far. I mean, it kind of touched on it, but just he has to face some bullshit a lot of filmmakers don't have to put up with.
Yeah. So one more thing we want to do before we wrap this up is we got to get into our segment called Further Viewing. If you guys were doing a Poltergeist double feature with another film, what would be part 2 of that double feature?
I think it feels obviously like The Conjuring or something would work, or even Insidious. Like I'd even throw Insidious in there.
Yeah, especially the final act of Insidious. It has that, I don't know, that madhouse kind of.
Well, like people wrote it off. Like it's like, oh, it's Disney's like whatever the fuck.
I love the end of Insidious. I know I'm kind of in the. I feel like I'm in the minority on that, but I love the last act.
No, I think it's fun. Like I think it's just everybody. Well, it's the same. I think the same thing that happened there is the same thing that happens when people watch Poltergeist now. They want like a straightforward horror movie. They just want it to be like try to scare you as much as they can, but at the end of the day, that never works anyway. Like, 9 times out of 10, that doesn't work anyway. So the only thing to make it like an effective horror movie is to make you care about the characters and to try to make like a full-fledged, like fleshed out film. And so I think that's what Poltergeist is doing. I get it. It's not like, you're not talking about The Exorcist here. You're talking about Poltergeist. It's a totally different level of horror. And it is, sadly, it's like, what if Steven Spielberg made a horror movie? But it's like, it's fun and it's creepy in points. There's stuff that looks good. And it's like, it's just, they're trying to make a fleshed out horror movie. I don't know. It's so weird. People want horror movies to be accepted into the mainstream. I know I'm going off on a tangent and I'm sorry, but I also last night watched Cape Fear and
the original or the Scorsese
91, like Martin Scorsese.
Scorsese.
Yeah. And I want to see the other one because, on the old show we did Night of the Huntsman or whatever, and
Night of the Hunter.
Night of the Hunter. I don't know why I said Huntsman. I think I'm
Chris Hemsworth is not in.
Yeah, that's what I say. I'm thinking of the Snow White movie. Anyway, that guy is also in the original Cape Fear. My point being is that I'm watching Cape Fear, and as I was watching it, I just started like scrolling through some trivia on like Cape Fear, and there was this thing that like Fangoria was barred from covering Cape Fear at the time,
because they didn't also want it to be called a horror movie,
right? They also did the same thing with Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah,
like, they didn't want these movies to be covered as horror movies.
Right.
Like they didn't.
It had a stigma at the time.
Yeah, like horror has a stigma, so it's weird. Like there's these weird points where in history, I don't know, it's odd. Like I look at Poltergeist and I'm like, yeah, it's a horror movie. Like it's straight up a horror movie, but it's like maybe they were trying to, like you said, like maybe Spielberg's like reining in Hooper at certain points. And
yeah,
and
but I think like, you mentioned The Conjuring and Insidious. I think that's proof that that horror has become more mainstream now.
I just mean like they're like evolutions of what this concept was, I think is where I was going with that.
Well, what do you think, Todd? What would be your second part of a Poltergeist double feature?
I think, and they don't line up as well as the movies you guys mentioned, but when I was watching this and saw some of the special effects, the movie that jumped out to me immediately was Ghostbusters. And I feel like that would be a fun, serious to funny, but with the spirits looking kind of similar. I feel like
all those optical effects and like, no,
it would feel like
works.
Like this happened on the West Coast, but in New York, this was happening.
Right.
Like, so that's the route I would go.
Yeah,
I think, Todd.
Yeah, I thought of The Conjuring and I thought of Insidious as well, but I kind of lean a little towards. The thing is, there's a lot of ghost movies out there. There aren't a lot of quote poltergeist movies, which are two different things. So it's kind of hard to think of another haunted house movie that's also poltergeist. So I just started thinking
15 seasons of Supernatural
or Paranormal Activity, but I don't like those movies very much. But I guess you could consider those poltergeist because they're more malevolent. I don't know. But I just started trying to think of some like haunted house movies that I like. And I got to say The Others with Nicole Kidman, one of my favorite haunted house movies, but honestly, and this doesn't quite work as like a double feature because of the length, but Mike Flanagan's The Haunting of Hill House. It's one of the best haunted house pieces of media like I've ever seen, ever. And they don't fit. I think Ghostbusters fits tonally a little bit better than Poltergeist and even maybe Insidious. But if we're just talking other ghost movies, or if you want to go a little more fun, The Frighteners.
Oh yeah,
I think The Frighteners would fit. Yeah,
I think any of these would fit. Well. Yeah,
I think Ghostbusters fits right there with it. It's like even if tonally it shifts a little bit, but I mean that's the same thing with like Insidious or something. It's like there's a little bit darker than Insidious goes than this movie does, but it's just like we were talking about. I feel like there's an evolution of like what they could do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Gary made the joke that, maybe Tobe Hooper does think that his career is cursed. But after Poltergeist, like, I totally understand why he would think that. Because the movie is great. The movie turned out great. But it's all that controversy surrounding the ownership of the movie that kind of undercut his legitimacy. Because he is a very good director. But all of a sudden, like, it's the guy who made Texas Chainsaw. He finally gets his big break in Hollywood, but he's not up to the job. And Steven Spielberg has to rescue the film and come in and direct it. That's kind of how that narrative played out to a lot of people. Yeah. And it hurt his career. I mean, it may have essentially destroyed his career. I mean, he would continue working for the rest of his life, but a lot of the stuff later in his career was straight to video trash. It's all... He never again had a chance to make a big studio movie like this one. This was it. This was his big break, and he nailed it. But because of that article in the LA Times, nobody else ever really gave him this chance again. It called his credibility into question. It sucks, and no amount of like setting the record straight by anybody, Hooper, Spielberg, all the cast and crew, doesn't matter what any of them said. In people's minds, Spielberg might have directed this movie, and that never left anyone's mind, Yeah. But the truth is, I think Spielberg and Hooper collaborated on a film that is, like I said, I think one of the best haunted house movies ever made. It brought the hauntings out of the Gothic structures, out of the castles, and brought them into modern day suburbia, and the genre's never looked back. So we're going to be taking a bit of a detour next week. We're starting actually a new series. We're not going to continue on the career of Tobe Hooper just yet. We're taking a detour for a few weeks for reasons that will become clear as we go along. And then we will get back into where Tobe Hooper's career went after Poltergeist a little bit down the line. But next week, we're going to start a new series called Dan O'Bannon, Hollywood's Secret Weapon. If you're not familiar with Dan O'Bannon, just know that he's a screenwriter and he directed twice, but he's mostly known as a screenwriter. But he's been connected to more Hollywood, like big Hollywood films and franchises than you might realize. And I don't think he really gets enough credit as how big of a impact he really had in multiple careers in Hollywood, and never really had the career himself that he deserved, which kind of, makes it feels a little bit like Tobe Hooper, but we'll see how those two interact later on down the line. So
These boys is going to cross paths.
Yeah, they are. So to begin this story, we're going back to discuss O'Bannon's first film, co-written by O'Bannon and John Carpenter. It was also John Carpenter's first film as a director. Next week, we're going to be talking about a 1975 film called Dark Star. Ooh. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to it. It's easy to find. If you guys want to stream it and watch it along with us, head to cinemashock.net where you can find links to the stream it, and join us back next week as we discuss the making of that film. I think it's going to be a fun one to talk about because, we're not only talking about the beginning of O'Bannon's career, but we're talking about the beginning of John Carpenter, who is, one of the greatest horror directors to ever live. So
it's so crazy. I was scrolling through the, for what it's worth here at the end of the episode. This is from, I'm just gonna read this little part here. It's from Joe Bob Briggs's obituary for Tobe Hooper as we get to it here. He says, talking about the LA Times article, said that Spielberg was the actual director of the thing. Hooper was naturally disturbed by the article and wrote a letter to the reporter trying to clear things up. Spielberg became irate. And when he found out that Hooper had written the letter, Spielberg had investors and backers who wanted him working on another project at the time. He was concerned that support for that project would dry up if he was caught goofing off on Poltergeist. Spielberg told Hooper to just keep his mouth shut, and relations between the two men became strained. They later would patch things up, and Hooper would go on to work with Spielberg on several projects. I said a lot of this, but the part I wanted to get to is this. He said, the damage was done. When the movie was released, review after review took note of the rumor that Hooper hadn't really directed this film. Spielberg finally took out a full-page ad in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, giving Hooper full credit for the film and discounting the rumors, but nobody believed it. As late as this year, 35 years later, an assistant cameraman was giving interviews to a blogger saying he witnessed Spielberg ghost directing, and the libel was passed along to the public, even though the cameraman had no access to the daily directorial meetings. Twice successful, twice cursed, Hooper seemed to be the only director in history who couldn't get work even after two movies that earned more than $100 million each, movies that would both be acclaimed as classics. Time and time again, he was asked to prove himself. Even as Poltergeist took the suburban multiplexes by storm and Chainsaw continued to play drive-ins, overseas territories, midnight movie houses, often on a double bill with David Lynch's Eraserhead. After a 5-year censorship fight in France, Chainsaw opened to the, this is what I was talking about. He said open to on the Champs-Élysées in 1982 and had grosses higher than Superman. For a 1983 release by New Line Cinema, the gross was $6 million, an unheard of figure for a 9-year-old film that already had been released on video. Chainsaw would end up being seen in more than 90 countries, sometimes dubbed, sometimes subtitled, sometimes marketed in an almost unrecognizable way. And he said, no matter. After Poltergeist, Hooper was forced back into the independent film world. The only reason, well, we'll get into the next part, but after this film, he basically goes on to say, like, Hooper, just like all his respect was lost essentially after this one.
Yeah, which is kind of a bummer because he directed the hell out of this movie and it made a lot of money, but it was just, I guess it shows the power of like rumors and it sucks, man. It really sucks because this is a man's livelihood. And and he was never out of work. I mean, like I said, he directed until he died. His last movie came out in 2013. He died in 2017, but he directed his whole life. But yeah, he got forced back into doing independent movies after this, and which we will discuss in a few weeks. And then he did a lot of TV shows, and then he did a bunch of made for TV or straight to video garbage horror movies, Yeah. It's kind of a shame.
Yeah, I don't mean to jump ahead. It's just interesting. Like, as I'm looking through this stuff, it's just how much this stuff hits. I just want to clarified just how much this does ruin your career, like your access in Hollywood, like that people, like the perception is reality, that the second that somebody questions like your authority on like a film like this.
Well, and that's why we called this series The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper, because this is a guy who had all the potential in the world on Texas Chainsaw, made a movie that is considered by many to be the greatest horror movie of all time. And he had some bumps in the road here and there, but some relative success, with the exception of Eaten Alive. I mean, Salem's Lot and even The Funhouse were relatively successful. Then Poltergeist was huge, and this should have made him an A-list director. But because of this bullshit article in the LA Times that called his credibility into question, all of that was out the window. It didn't matter how good he had done in the past. All of it was out the window.
And going back to the beginning of this episode, when I talked about like you have to have a little bit of an ego to be a director, I mean, that comes from, as I'm watching it, I'm like, to many people, this would probably seem like a guy with ego. But in this one interview I watched where, they were talking about the curse, and he was talking about the tragedy that was Heather and like all of this stuff. He was like, like I had the leg thing and we were laughing about it, but he was like, I'm alive. I'm here. He's like, but maybe, and this interview was probably 2013 or something close to his death. I mean, he's sitting there saying, he's like, I don't know. He's like going back and looking and just, who else had to deal with this kind of bullshit? He's like, I had to deal with so much bullshit. Every single time I got close, there was so much shit that he's like, so I just, he's like, maybe there was a curse. I don't know.
We're going to further explore the career of Tobe Hooper in a few weeks, but we do want to talk about Dan O'Bannon first because, yes, their paths will cross in a way that's pretty important, but we want to establish Dan O'Bannon first before we get into those films that they collaborated on, and also because Dan O'Bannon is another guy who just kind of got shafted by the system, man. And so, like, it's not the same story, but there are some parallels. It's kind of wild. So we're going to talk about that next week, and for the next few weeks, we'll be diving into Dan O'Bannon's career. Again, go to cinemashock.net for all the information on where you can find those films. You can also find all of our episodes on there and links where to subscribe to us. If you do subscribe, we hope you do, rate and review and everything as well. You can also follow us at cinema_shock. That is on Twitter and Instagram. You can also like us on Facebook. Share us with all your friends, especially if they're, into this kind of shit, man. If they're into like cool genre movies, we'll tell them everything they ever wanted to know about them.
Hey man, it may sound like I'm like laying the whole plot out here for you, but we're just like counting on you to stick through and like want to hear the history of it. Obviously things aren't going to work out perfectly for Tobe Hooper. That's why this series is called The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper. But I mean, the thing is one of the beautiful parts about this guy is he's a true believer. Like he sticks with it. Like this is not the end for Tobe Hooper. It's just that this whole story is just kind of, as an artist, it's kind of fucked up. But it's this guy, like Justin said, we're going to jump into Dan O'Bannon here, and it's especially important because, well, he's important, and then also he's going to cross paths with the man that we're talking about here this week. And these guys are guys that have stories to tell. They have things they want to write, and they're doing it, and they're pushing for it to succeed. And sadly, that's not always the biggest success, which is the bummer. But you gotta, I don't know. I guess this is our opportunity to pay respects to the people that, despite all the bullshit, stuck with their vision and tried to do something.
So you guys want to tell our listeners where you can be found on the internet if they'd like to follow along on your journey, your tragedy.
Something for my great kids to listen back and say, listen to this fucking dork thinking he was doing anything.
So here am I failing. You can follow me at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all the socials, and if you like Star Trek, at Computer Resume on all the socials for my podcast, Computer Resume Podcast, where we're covering the entire Star Trek franchise.
For better or worse, the tragedy of Gene Roddenberry.
Yep, the tragedy of Gene Roddenberry.
The real tragedy begins with Todd's podcast.
Enterprise, episode 1.
Oh, you're not wrong. Oh, boy, oh boy.
Oh,
Gary Horn.
I am Matt. This is Gary Horn. That's with an E. The silent till midnight, ladies. That's my dad joke.
Yeah, you've made it here before. It's all right.
Yeah, I know. I just like to clarify that my dad taught me that. But it feels important to specify with an E sometimes. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I do this podcast and I'm very happy about it. You can find me at This Is Gary Horn on all the things. I also do another podcast about professional wrestling over at TIPW Show. It's called This Is Pro Wrestling. So at TIPW Show. And we're doing a whole, like, even if you don't think you know anything about wrestling, if you like what we do here about movies, we're doing the same thing right now about pro wrestling over on that show. So if you ever want to get into it, deep dives. We just covered like Gotch versus Hackenschmidt. And not like a boring fuck.
I don't know who those people are, but I listened to the first episode a couple days ago, and it's fun stuff, Gary. It is really good.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we got into like the Greeks and the biblical side of things, but we get into like the real like nitty gritty of like the carnies and the carnivals and that sort of thing. And Frank Gotch, George Hackenschmidt, the original like OG wrestlers, and we try to make it fun. I do a lot of impersonations on that show.
He's just as good there as he is here.
Yeah, so for better or worse, that happens. And so anyway, you should check that out. At TIPW Show.
All right, and I'm at Justin_Bishop. I don't have any other shows, just this one. This one takes up enough of my free time.
I was going to say one's enough.
Maybe one day, if you guys start paying me to do this, I'll be able to do another show. But until then, just follow me at Justin_Bishop, where you can see pictures of me on Instagram or mostly my dogs. Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
Still hate that.
Still doing it.
Yep.
It doesn't work as like a sign off, though. Like a sign off has to be like this is something you can take with you the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Be excellent to each other.
Well, listen, how many people
the wings
lose
of
their
liberty
keys?
never lose a feather? That feels like a real patriotic statement to me.
Yeah.
When people lose their keys, all they have to remember is that Johnny has the keys.
That's not going to help anyone.
What if they don't know anybody named Johnny?
It didn't help her. It didn't help Barbara.
I know.
They all died.
They all died.